A lone schoolteacher stands on a Montana dust road, rifle raised, having just fired a warning shot at a stranger's boot. The year is 1872, and Eleanor Hayes refuses to be anyone's victim. When rancher Caleb Morgan rounds that bend, neither expects the collision of wills, danger, and desire that will transform them both. This is the story of a woman who demanded respect before love, and the man strong enough to give it. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels. And if you love tales of courage, independence, and frontier romance, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't regret it. The dust rose in amber clouds along the Montana road, hanging in the late afternoon heat like a veil between earth and sky. Eleanor Hayes stood beside the broken stagecoach, her dark traveling dress already filmed with the fine powder that covered everything in this God-forsaken territory. The wheel lay splintered 20 feet back, victim to a rut deep enough to swallow a man's boot. The driver had unhitched the horses and ridden for help 2 hours ago, promising to return before nightfall. He hadn't returned. Eleanor didn't trust promises anymore. She checked the rifle in her hands for the third time. A Winchester repeater she'd purchased in St. Louis over the scandalized protests of the gunsmith's wife. The weight of it had felt foreign then, an anchor dragging at her arms during practice sessions behind her boarding house. Now it felt like an extension of her will, solid and certain in a world that offered neither. The sun had begun its descent toward the Sawtooth Mountains in the west, painting the peaks in shades of copper and blood. Eleanor calculated she had perhaps 90 minutes of good light remaining. After that, the wolves would emerge from the pine forest that bordered the road. She'd heard them the previous night from inside the stagecoach, their howls echoing across the valleys like the voices of the damned. She was not afraid of wolves. She was afraid of men. The sound of hoofbeats reached her before she saw the rider, a steady rhythm that spoke of confidence and unhurried purpose. Eleanor moved to the far side of the stagecoach, using its bulk as cover while she positioned herself with a clear line of sight down the road. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. She'd learned years ago that fear was only useful if you controlled it, shaped it into something sharp enough to cut. The rider appeared around the bend, a dark silhouette against the declining sun. Man-shaped, broad-shouldered, sitting his horse like he'd been born in the saddle. Eleanor couldn't make out his features yet, but she cataloged every detail her eyes could capture. The rifle boot strapped to his saddle, the wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the glare, the easy way he held the reins that suggested this was a man comfortable with power. Comfortable men were often the most dangerous. She waited until he was 30 yards out, close enough that her warning would be unmistakable. Then she raised the Winchester, sighted down the barrel at a point 6 inches to the left of his horse's front hooves, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the gunshot split the evening quiet like lightning through dry timber. Dust exploded where the bullet struck, and the rider's horse reared, pawing at air with iron-shod hooves. But the man didn't fall. He didn't even flinch. He sat deep in the saddle, moving with the animal's panic rather than fighting it, and brought the horse back under control with a firm hand and what sounded like a low, soothing word. Then he looked directly at her hiding place. "That was either the worst shot I've ever seen," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance, "or the best warning. I'm hoping for the latter." Eleanor stepped out from behind the stagecoach, rifle still raised, the stock pressed firm against her shoulder. "Consider yourself warned. This road is occupied." The rider nudged his horse forward, slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible. As he drew closer, Eleanor could finally see his face beneath the brim of his hat. He was perhaps 35, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of mountain stone, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the peaks behind him. No beard, just dark stubble that suggested he'd left his ranch in a hurry. There was something about the set of his shoulders, the way he carried himself, that spoke of authority earned rather than claimed. "Road's free to all travelers, ma'am," he said, reining in his horse about 15 feet away. Close enough to talk, far enough to demonstrate he wasn't a threat. "But I can see you've got cause to be cautious. I'm Caleb Morgan. I own the Three Rivers Ranch about 8 miles west of here." "I don't care if you own half of Montana," Eleanor replied, her voice level. I don't know you, and I don't make a habit of trusting strangers just because they introduce themselves. Something flickered across Caleb Morgan's face. Surprise, perhaps, or appreciation. He shifted in his saddle, and Eleanor's finger tightened on the trigger. Easy, he said, raising one hand slowly. I'm just adjusting my seat, not reaching for anything. You've made your point, ma'am. You know how to handle that rifle, and you're not afraid to use it. But here's the situation as I see it. You've got a broken stagecoach, no driver, and night coming on fast. These mountains aren't forgiving after dark, especially not to someone alone. I'm armed. So are the wolves. He paused, letting that sink in. And they hunt in packs. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She'd already considered that particular problem and arrived at no satisfactory solution. She could climb into the stagecoach and barricade herself inside, but that would only work until something, or someone, decided they wanted in badly enough. The stagecoach wasn't a fortress. It was a wooden box on wheels, and one of those wheels was currently in pieces. "What's your proposition?" she asked. "My ranch is 8 miles west, like I said. I've got a spare room, clean sheets, and a housekeeper who'll serve as chaperone, so there's no question about propriety. You can sleep safe, eat a hot meal, and in the morning I'll send some of my men back here with a replacement wheel for your coach, or I can arrange transport to wherever you're heading." "And if I refuse?" Caleb Morgan studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes steady. "Then I'll wish you luck, ride on, and spend the rest of the night wondering if you survived. But I won't force you, and I won't push. A woman's got a right to make her own choices, even foolish ones." The casual insult sparked anger in Eleanor's chest, hot and immediate. "Foolish? You think it's foolish for a woman to be cautious about accepting help from strange men on empty roads?" "I think it's foolish to let caution turn into stubbornness that gets you killed," he replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than argumentative. "There's a difference between being careful and being stupid. One keeps you alive, the other just keeps you alone until something decides you're prey." Eleanor wanted to shoot him again, just on principle, but the infuriating truth was that he was right. She'd traveled 2,000 miles from Philadelphia to reach Montana territory, survived 3 train changes, 2 stagecoach transfers, and a riverboat journey that had nearly ended with her in the Missouri River when a drunk passenger decided a woman traveling alone must be looking for company. She hadn't come this far to die on a dusty road because she was too proud to accept help when she genuinely needed it. But she also hadn't survived those 2,000 miles by trusting easily. "You'll ride ahead," she said, lowering the rifle slightly but not putting it down. "I'll follow at a distance. If you reach for your weapon, if you turn around, if you do anything that makes me uncomfortable, I will shoot you, not as a warning this time." Caleb Morgan's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Fair enough. You know how to ride?" "Well enough. The stagecoach horses are gone with your driver, but I saw a saddled mount grazing about a quarter-mile back. Brown mare with a white blaze. Looked like she might have thrown her rider." Eleanor's stomach turned cold. "You saw a riderless horse and didn't investigate?" "I saw a riderless horse, fresh tracks showing she'd come from the direction of Redwood Crossing, and no signs of blood or struggle. Either her rider dismounted willingly, or they parted ways over a disagreement about direction. Either way, the horse was fine and heading home. I figured I'd check on the stagecoach I could see before chasing down mysteries I couldn't." It was a practical answer, the kind a rancher would give. Eleanor found herself reassessing the man in front of her. He thought in terms of priorities and probabilities, not assumptions and emotions. That was uncommon in her experience. "I'll retrieve my belongings from the coach," she said. "Then we'll proceed as I outlined." "Yes, ma'am." This time the smile was definite, small, but genuine. "Might I ask your name, since we're going to be traveling companions for the next few hours?" Eleanor hesitated. Giving her name felt like giving something away, a small piece of power she wasn't sure she wanted to surrender. But refusing would be childish, and whatever else she was, Eleanor Hayes was not a child. "Eleanor Hayes, I'm the new school teacher for Redwood Crossing." Caleb Morgan's eyebrows rose. "The new teacher? We've been waiting on you for 6 weeks. The town council was starting to think you'd changed your mind." "I don't change my mind once it's made, Mr. Morgan. There were delays, paperwork, travel connections, an outbreak of cholera in St. Louis that shut down train service for 2 weeks. But I signed a contract, and I honor my commitments. That's good to hear. Redwood Crossing needs a teacher who'll stick. We've had 3 in the last 4 years, and none of them lasted more than a season. Eleanor felt a familiar spike of irritation. Let me guess. They were all women who came west expecting adventure and romance, then fled when they discovered the reality of frontier life was hard work, isolation, and communities that didn't appreciate education. 2 of them married within 3 months and gave up teaching, Caleb admitted. The third lasted a whole winter, then went back east claiming the cold had damaged her constitution. But the real reason was that she couldn't handle parents who thought reading and writing were less important than farming and ranching. And you think I'll be different? Caleb Morgan looked at her, really looked, his gray eyes traveling from her face to the rifle in her hands to the determined set of her shoulders. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Eleanor listen despite herself. Ma'am, you just fired a warning shot at a stranger's boot, held me at gunpoint for 10 minutes, and negotiated terms for your own safety like a general arranging a truce. You're either the most stubborn woman I've ever met or the most capable. Either way, I don't think you'll run at the first sign of difficulty. Eleanor felt something unexpected unfold in her chest. Not quite pride, not quite vindication, but somewhere between the two. It had been a long time since anyone had recognized her strength as an asset rather than an inconvenience. I'll get my trunk, she said, turning toward the stagecoach. Let me help. No. The word came out sharp as a blade. I'll manage. She heard him sigh behind her, but he didn't argue. Good. Eleanor had spent 28 years learning that the moment you let someone carry your burdens, they started thinking they owned the right to tell you where to set them down. Her trunk was heavy, packed with books and teaching supplies that weighed more than her clothes and personal items combined. She dragged it to the rear of the stagecoach, then jumped down and muscled it onto her shoulder. Her legs trembled under the weight, but she locked her knees and walked it 10 feet to clear ground before setting it down with a controlled thud. When she turned back, Caleb Morgan was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not admiration. She'd seen enough of that from men who fetishize strength in women while simultaneously trying to break it. Not mockery either. It was something closer to recognition. Like he was seeing something familiar in her stubborn independence. The mare should still be close, he said, as if the past minute of watching her struggle hadn't happened. I'll help you catch her. I thought I was supposed to follow at a distance. You are. But first you need a horse, unless you plan to walk 8 miles carrying that trunk. Eleanor glanced at the heavy case. Point taken. They found the mare exactly where Caleb had said, grazing contentedly in a patch of sweet grass near a cluster of pines. The horse raised her head as they approached, ears forward, then went back to eating when she decided they weren't a threat. Eleanor approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. Easy, girl. That's right. Nobody's going to hurt you. The mare allowed Eleanor to take her reins without protest. Up close, Eleanor could see the horse was well cared for. Groomed coat, clean hooves, good teeth. Someone had valued this animal. The saddle was worn but quality leather, the kind that molded to a rider's seat over years of use. You know horses, Caleb observed. I know enough. My father kept a stable in Philadelphia. I learned to ride before I learned to read. But you learned to read. Eleanor met his eyes. I learned everything, Mr. Morgan. My father believed education was wasted on daughters, but my mother disagreed. She taught me in secret, reading, writing, mathematics, history, philosophy. When he discovered what she'd done, he burned every book in the house and forbade her from teaching me another word. But she kept teaching you anyway. No. Eleanor's voice went flat. She was too afraid. So I taught myself. I found work as a maid in houses with libraries, stole moments with books when no one was watching, memorized what I could before I had to put them back. By the time I was 16, I'd read more than most college men. By 20, I'd passed the teaching examination in secret. And by 25, I'd saved enough money to leave Philadelphia and make my own life. Caleb was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. That takes courage. That takes necessity. Courage is what you call it when you have choices. I didn't. She turned away from him, adjusting the mare's saddle, checking the cinch. It was tight enough. Whoever had ridden this horse last knew what they were doing. Your trunk won't fit on the horse, Caleb said. We'll have to come back for it tomorrow with a wagon. Eleanor's hand stilled on the saddle. I'm not leaving my books. They'll be safe enough for one night. You don't understand. Those books are... She stopped herself, hearing the emotion bleeding into her voice. They're important. I understand more than you think, Miss Hayes. Caleb's voice had gentled. But it's nearly dark, and 8 miles is hard riding in full light. In the dark, it's dangerous. We need to move now, or we don't move at all. Your books will still be here in the morning. Eleanor wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed at her to fight this, to refuse to leave behind the precious cargo she'd carried across half a continent. But the sinking sun painted the mountains in shades of purple and shadow, and somewhere in the darkening forest, a wolf howled. The sound raised the hair on the back of her neck. Fine, she said, the word tasting like defeat. But we return for them first thing tomorrow. You have my word. Eleanor swung into the saddle, grateful for the familiar feel of a horse beneath her. The mare danced sideways, testing this new rider, but Eleanor held firm with her knees and took up the reins with confident hands. The horse settled. Caleb mounted his own horse, a big roan gelding that looked like it could carry him through hell and back without breaking stride. Ready? I've been ready since Philadelphia, Mr. Morgan. Lead the way. He turned his horse west and started down the road at an easy walk. Eleanor followed at the distance she'd specified, close enough to keep him in sight, far enough to shoot him if he proved treacherous. The rifle lay across her saddle, ready. They rode in silence for the first mile. The only sounds, the steady clop of hooves on packed earth and the evening chorus of insects waking in the grass. The mountains grew larger as they traveled, no longer distant peaks but looming presences that blocked out stars. Eleanor had never felt so small, so insignificant. Philadelphia had been crowded with buildings and people, every space filled with humanity's mark. Here, the land stretched vast and indifferent, making it clear that humans were temporary visitors at best. You picked a hard place to make your stand, Caleb said, breaking the silence. He didn't turn around, honoring their agreement. I didn't pick Montana for ease, Mr. Morgan. Why did you pick it then? Eleanor considered not answering, but something about riding through the gathering dark, separated by space but bound by their careful truce, made honesty easier than usual. Because no one else wanted it. The teaching positions in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, they all went to men or to women with family connections. I had neither. But Montana territory? Montana is desperate enough to hire a woman without references, without connections, without anything but competence. Out here, what you can do matters more than who you are. You think that's true? I'm hoping it's true. I'm gambling my entire future on the possibility that it might be true. If I'm wrong, she let the sentence trail off. If you're wrong, you'll find out quick, Caleb finished. Frontier doesn't let you hide from mistakes. Good. I'm tired of hiding. They rode another mile in companionable silence. The sky had deepened to indigo, and the first stars emerged like pinpricks in dark cloth. Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait and the surprising comfort of Caleb Morgan's steady presence ahead of her. He rode like a man at home in his skin, no wasted movement, no false bravado, just competence and quiet confidence. It was attractive, in an unsettling way. Can I ask you something, Miss Hayes? Caleb's voice drifted back to her. You can ask. I may not answer. Fair enough. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Why the rifle? Most women traveling out here carry a pistol if they carry anything. Easier to conceal, easier to handle. Eleanor smiled in the darkness. Most women traveling out here aren't planning to defend themselves, Mr. Morgan. They're planning to scare someone long enough to scream for help. A pistol is a deterrent. A rifle is a statement of intent. She heard him chuckle, a low sound that seemed to rumble up from his chest. And what's your intent, Miss Hayes? To be taken seriously, to never be dismissed, underestimated, or treated like a problem someone else needs to solve. I came west to teach, Mr. Morgan, but also to live on my own terms. If that requires shooting the occasional warning shot at a stranger's boot, then so be it. That was a hell of a warning shot. That was an average Tuesday in Philadelphia. You should see what I can do when I'm actually trying. This time his laugh was full and genuine, echoing across the darkening landscape. Eleanor found herself smiling despite her determination to remain aloof. There was something disarming about a man who could appreciate a woman's sharp edges instead of trying to file them smooth. The road began to climb, switching back through pine forest that rose steep on either side. The air grew cooler, scented with resin and the sharp clarity of high altitude. Eleanor's mare picked her way carefully over loose stones, and Eleanor gave the horse her head, trusting the animal's instincts over her own limited night vision. "Not far now," Caleb called back. "Maybe 2 more miles." Eleanor didn't respond, too focused on keeping her seat as the trail grew rougher. Her legs ached from gripping the saddle, and her shoulders protested the weight of the rifle. It had been months since she'd ridden this long, and her body was making its complaints known. Then the mare stumbled. It happened fast, a loose rock, a misstep, a sickening moment of free fall as the horse fought for balance. Eleanor felt herself sliding sideways, felt the rifle slipping from her grip, felt gravity asserting its inevitable claim. She hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Pain exploded through her left shoulder and hip, bright and overwhelming. The rifle clattered somewhere to her right, and the mare danced away, spooked but uninjured. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but lie in the dirt and try to remember how her lungs worked. The sky wheeled above her, stars spinning in dizzying circles. Then Caleb was there, kneeling beside her, his face etched with concern. "Don't move. Let me check." "Get away from me." The words came out as a wheeze, but Eleanor put every ounce of will she possessed behind them. "Don't touch me." "Miss Hayes, you just fell off a horse. You could be injured." "I said don't touch me." She rolled onto her side, gasping, forcing air back into her body through sheer stubbornness. Every breath felt like broken glass, but she breathed anyway. "I'm fine." "You're absolutely not fine." Caleb's voice held exasperation now, the first real emotion she'd heard from him. "You can barely breathe, you're lying in the dirt, and you're shaking. Let me help you." "I don't need help." Eleanor pushed herself up onto one elbow, then her hands and knees. The world tilted sickeningly, but she locked her jaw against the nausea and forced herself upright. "I just need a moment." "You need a doctor." "I need—" Eleanor swayed, and suddenly Caleb's hands were on her shoulders, steadying her. She should have pushed him away, should have maintained her fierce independence. But the truth was, without his support, she would have collapsed back into the dirt. And Eleanor Hayes did not collapse. "I need to get back on that horse," she finished, hating how weak her voice sounded. Caleb studied her face in the starlight. Whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. "All right, but we're going to do this careful, and you're going to let me help you mount. No arguments." Eleanor wanted to argue on principle, but her body had other ideas, sending waves of pain through her shoulder and hip that suggested stubbornness might actually kill her this time. "No arguments," she agreed quietly. He helped her to her feet with a gentleness that surprised her. His hands were steady and impersonal, supporting without claiming, helping without condescending. When she swayed again, he simply adjusted his grip and waited for her to find her balance. The mare had settled a few yards away, watching them with what Eleanor would have sworn was equine judgment. Caleb retrieved the horse's reins, then came back for Eleanor. "I'm going to lift you into the saddle," he said. "It's going to hurt, but it'll hurt less than trying to mount on your own. Ready?" Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. His hands circled her waist, strong and sure. In one smooth motion, he lifted her, and he was right. It did hurt, a sharp lance of agony through her injured shoulder that made her gasp. But then she was in the saddle, and the pain receded to a dull roar she could manage. Caleb handed her the reins, then retrieved her rifle from where it had fallen. He checked it over carefully, ensuring the barrel wasn't bent and the mechanism hadn't jammed before handing it back to her. "Still loaded," he said. "Still ready to shoot me if I give you cause." Eleanor managed a weak smile. "Good to know my options remain open." "That's the spirit." He mounted his own horse, then looked back at her. His face was serious now, all traces of humor gone. "I'm going to lead your horse, Miss Hayes. Don't argue, don't fight me, just hold on and stay in the saddle. Can you do that?" Every instinct rebelled against the idea of surrendering even that much control. But Eleanor was many things, stubborn, proud, fiercely independent, but she wasn't stupid. And staying in the saddle on her own, injured and increasingly dizzy, was beyond her current capabilities. "I can do that," she said. Caleb took the mare's reins and tied them loosely to his saddle horn, creating a lead line that would keep the horses together without binding them so tightly that Eleanor's mare couldn't move naturally. Then he set off again, slower this time, his attention split between the trail ahead and the woman behind him. Eleanor focused on not falling. It took all her concentration to stay upright as the horses navigated the darkening trail, every jolt sending fresh pain through her injured side. She wrapped her free hand around the saddle horn and held on grimly, refusing to call out, refusing to ask for a rest, refusing to show any more weakness than she already had. Time lost meaning. There was only the darkness, the pain, the rhythm of the horse beneath her, and Caleb Morgan's solid presence ahead. Eleanor found herself watching the set of his shoulders, the easy way he sat his mount even while leading hers. He'd called her stubborn earlier, but he was equally obstinate in his determination to get her to safety. It should have annoyed her. Instead, she found it oddly comforting. Finally, hours later, or perhaps only minutes, Eleanor couldn't tell, lights appeared ahead. Not city lights, but the warm glow of windows in the darkness, scattered in a pattern that suggested buildings arranged around a central yard. The Three Rivers Ranch. Caleb rode straight to what looked like the main house, a solid two-story structure built from logs and stone. He dismounted, tied both horses, then turned to Eleanor. "Can you get down on your own?" Eleanor tried. She truly did. But when she moved her left leg to swing it over the saddle, her entire body screamed protest and the world grayed at the edges. "I'll take that as a no," Caleb said, and lifted her down before she could object. This time she didn't fight him. She simply leaned against his chest for one brief moment, gathering her strength, breathing in the scent of leather and horses and honest sweat. Then she pushed away and stood on her own feet, wobbling but upright. "I can walk," she said. "I know you can, but you don't have to." Before Eleanor could process what he meant, Caleb swept her up into his arms, cradling her against his chest like she weighed nothing. She should have protested. She should have demanded he put her down immediately. Instead, she was too tired to do anything but rest her head against his shoulder and let him carry her toward the light. The door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and sharp, assessing eyes. She took in the scene at a glance, the dusty, injured woman in her employer's arms, the concern on Caleb's face, and stepped aside. "Spare room," she said without preamble. "I'll get hot water and bandages." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen." Caleb carried Eleanor through a main room furnished with rough-hewn furniture and practical comfort, then up a flight of stairs to a small bedroom at the rear of the house. He laid her gently on the bed, a real bed with a corn-husk mattress and clean quilts. Eleanor sank into it with a sigh that was nearly a sob, her body finally releasing the tension that had held her upright for the past hours. "Mrs. Chen will help you clean up and check your injuries," Caleb said, stepping back. "She stitched up more cowboys and ranchers than the doc in town. You're in good hands." Eleanor looked up at him, this stranger who'd become her unlikely rescuer. His face was shadowed in the lamplight, but his eyes were still clear, still steady. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not leaving me on that road." "Thank you for not shooting me," he replied with a small smile. "Though I admit, there were moments I wasn't sure you wouldn't." "The night's not over yet, Mr. Morgan." His smile widened into something genuine and warm. "No, Miss Hayes, I suppose it's not." Then he was gone, and Mrs. Chen arrived with hot water, clean cloths, and a bottle of something that smelled like it could strip paint. Eleanor submitted to the housekeeper's efficient ministrations, gritting her teeth as the woman cleaned the road dirt from her scrapes and examined her bruised shoulder and hip. "Nothing broken, Mrs. Buss," Chen pronounced finally, "but you'll be sore as hell for a few days. I'll make you willow bark tea for the pain." "I don't need—" "Wasn't asking." Mrs. Chen fixed her with a look that could have frozen the Missouri River. "You're hurt, you're exhausted, and you're in my house now. That means you follow my rules. Rule 1, when I say drink the tea, you drink the tea." Eleanor found herself smiling despite the pain. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. You learn quick. That'll help you survive out here." Mrs. Chen headed for the door, then paused. Mr. Morgan's a good man, one of the best I've known. You can trust him. I'll make that determination myself, thank you. Mrs. Chen's expression softened almost imperceptibly. I figured you'd say that. You've got spine, girl. You'll need it for what's coming. What's coming? Redwood Crossing, teaching, this territory, all of it. She shrugged. But you'll figure it out. You're the type who does. Then she was gone, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts, her pain, and the strange realization that for the first time in years, she felt almost safe. She slept fitfully, waking every few hours to strange sounds, coyotes yipping in the distance, the creak of the house settling, footsteps in the hallway that she told herself were probably Mrs. Chen checking on the household. Each time she woke, her hand found the rifle Caleb had left leaning against the wall by her bed, and each time she relaxed when she confirmed it was still there. Old habits died hard. Dawn came slowly, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold visible through the room's single window. Eleanor levered herself out of bed, biting back a groan as her abused body protested every movement. She was stiff, sore, and covered in bruises that were already turning spectacular shades of purple and green. But she was alive, and she had work to do. She found her way downstairs following the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The main room looked different in daylight, larger, more lived in, with books on shelves and maps on walls and a stone fireplace big enough to roast an entire pig. Caleb sat at a long wooden table, reading a newspaper while Mrs. Chen moved efficiently around a cast-iron stove. He looked up when Eleanor entered, and something flickered across his face. Relief, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement. "Miss Hayes, how are you feeling?" "Like I fell off a horse," Eleanor said honestly. "But I'll live. Good morning, Mrs. Chen." The housekeeper grunted acknowledgement without turning from her cooking. Eleanor took that as permission to sit at the table, though she chose a chair opposite Caleb rather than beside him. Maintaining distance seemed important, even here in his home where he'd shown her nothing but courtesy. "I've already sent 2 men to retrieve your trunk," Caleb said, folding his newspaper. "They'll bring it here and then we can arrange transport to Redwood Crossing whenever you're ready to travel." "Today. Miss Hayes, I'm expected in Redwood Crossing, Mr. Morgan. I'm already 6 weeks late. I won't delay any further because of a few bruises." "Those aren't just bruises. You could barely walk last night." "Last night I'd just fallen off a horse. This morning I've had sleep and—" She glanced toward Mrs. Chen. "Surprisingly excellent medical care. I'm functional enough for an 8-mile ride." Caleb studied her with those steady gray eyes, and Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. She'd learned long ago that the moment you showed weakness, men decided they knew better than you what you could handle. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but I'm riding with you, non-negotiable." Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. The truth was, she'd feel safer with an escort, even if she'd die before admitting it out loud. And there was something about Caleb Morgan that suggested his company wouldn't be a burden. "Acceptable," she said. Mrs. Chen set plates in front of them, bacon, eggs, fresh bread with butter. Eleanor's stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and she fell on the food with an enthusiasm that would have scandalized her Philadelphia finishing school teachers. Caleb watched her eat with what might have been amusement. "Hungry?" "Starving. This is excellent, Mrs. Chen." Another grunt. But Eleanor thought she saw the ghost of a smile cross the housekeeper's weathered face. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the sounds of breakfast and the distant lowing of cattle. Through the window, Eleanor could see the ranch spreading out, corrals, barns, a bunkhouse, and beyond it all, mountains that seemed to touch the sky. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, like the land itself was a challenge waiting to be accepted or rejected. Eleanor intended to accept. "Tell me about Redwood Crossing," she said as she finished her coffee. "What should I expect?" Caleb leaned back in his chair, considering. "It's a mining town, mostly. Silver in the mountains brought people in about 10 years ago, and enough of them stayed to make a proper settlement, maybe 300 permanent residents, more during mining season. There's a general store, a church, 2 saloons, a boarding house, and the schoolhouse, which is also where town meetings happen." "What about the children? How many students should I expect?" Last count was about 30, ages 5 to 15, could be more or less depending on who's still in the area. Families come and go with the mining work. Eleanor nodded, making mental calculations. 30 students of varying ages and abilities, all in one room with one teacher. It would be challenging, but she'd prepared for exactly this scenario. And the parents? What's their attitude toward education? Caleb's expression grew careful. Mixed. Some see the value. Others think it's a waste of time when kids could be working. A few think educating girls is unnecessary. You'll have to prove yourself. I'm used to that. I believe you are. He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. Miss Hayes, can I offer you some advice? Not as a man telling a woman what to do, but as someone who's lived in this territory for 15 years? Eleanor's defenses rose automatically, but she forced them down. I'm listening. Don't try to change everything at once. The folks in Redwood Crossing are good people, but they're set in their ways. They've seen teachers come and go, full of big ideas and Eastern education that doesn't account for frontier realities. If you come in trying to reform the whole town, they'll resist. But if you start small, prove your worth, show them education has practical value, you might actually make a difference. It was good advice, delivered without condescension. Eleanor found herself appreciating both the content and the delivery. I'll keep that in mind, she said, though I can't promise to move slowly if I see children suffering from ignorance or prejudice. I wouldn't expect you to. Just pick your battles. Not everything needs to be a war. Eleanor smiled, sharp and knowing. Mr. Morgan, everything is a war when you're a woman trying to do a man's job in a man's world. The only question is which battles you can win. Something in Caleb's expression shifted. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Then I hope you win the important ones, Miss Hayes. So do I, Mr. Morgan. So do I. To be continued. The ride to Redwood Crossing took most of the morning, and Eleanor used every mile to study the landscape that would become her home. The terrain shifted as they descended from Caleb's ranch, moving from pine forests into rolling grassland dotted with sage and wildflowers she couldn't name. The sky stretched overhead in a blue so vivid it hurt to look at, unmarred by the coal smoke that had perpetually hazed Philadelphia's horizon. Caleb rode beside her this time, rather than ahead, a subtle shift that Eleanor noticed but didn't comment on. His presence was less about control and more about companionship, and she found herself oddly grateful for it. The silence between them had evolved from the wary tension of yesterday into something more comfortable, broken occasionally by his pointing out landmarks or naming distant peaks. That's Widow's Peak to the north, he said, gesturing toward a mountain with a distinctive notch at its summit. And the river valley below is where most of the ranches are. Three Rivers gets its name from the confluence. The Madison, the Jefferson, and the Gallatin all meet about 5 miles from my property line. Eleanor absorbed the information, filing it away with everything else she was learning about this new world. The scale of it still staggered her. In Philadelphia, 5 miles meant crossing from one neighborhood to another, passing hundreds of buildings and thousands of people. Here, 5 miles was empty land where you might not see another human soul for days. How often do you come to town? She asked. Once a week for supplies, more if there's business that needs attending. Town council meets twice a month and I serve on it. Of course you do. Eleanor hadn't meant for the words to sound quite so dry, but Caleb smiled anyway. Someone has to. Redwood Crossing needs leadership that thinks past the next silver strike. Too many men out here are just looking to get rich quick and move on. Towns need people invested in their future, and you're invested. I've built my life here, Miss Hayes, my ranch, my reputation, my place in the community. That's not something you walk away from when times get hard. He glanced at her. I suspect you understand that kind of commitment. Eleanor did. She'd burned every bridge behind her when she left Philadelphia, invested every cent she owned in the journey west and the teaching position that waited at its end. There was no going back, only forward. Success or failure, she would face it here. I understand it perfectly, she said quietly. They crested a rise, and suddenly Redwood Crossing lay before them, a scatter of buildings arranged along a single main street, backed by the mountains and fronted by the river. It was smaller than Eleanor had imagined, more fragile, like a collection of children's blocks that a strong wind might scatter. But it was real, solid, hers. Her heart beat faster as they descended toward the town. This was it. The moment she'd traveled 2,000 miles to reach. Everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd risked, came down to what happened in the next few hours. Nervous? Caleb asked. Terrified, Eleanor admitted. But I've learned that terror and determination can occupy the same space. You just have to decide which one gets to drive. And you always choose determination. Always. They rode down the main street at a slow walk, and Eleanor felt eyes tracking their progress. People emerged from buildings, miners in dust-covered clothes, women in practical frontier dresses, children who should have been in school. Everyone stared. Eleanor lifted her chin and stared back, refusing to be cowed by curiosity or judgment. The schoolhouse stood at the far end of a town, a modest one-room building with a bell tower and windows that needed washing. Beside it was a small cottage that Eleanor assumed was the teacher's residence. Both buildings looked tired, worn down by weather and neglect, but fundamentally sound. Caleb dismounted and helped Eleanor down, his hands impersonal and steady. She was still sore from yesterday's fall, but she'd be damned if she'd limp in front of the entire town. She walked toward the schoolhouse with her back straight and her head high, every inch the competent professional educator she'd spent years becoming. The door opened before they reached it, and a man emerged, portly, 50-ish, with the prosperous look of someone who'd done well in the mining business. He extended his hand with a politician's smile. Miss Hayes, I presume. Samuel Hartwell, chairman of the town council and owner of the Lucky Strike mine. We're delighted you finally arrived. Eleanor shook his hand firmly, meeting his eyes. Mr. Hartwell, I apologize for the delay. There were complications beyond my control. Of course. The frontier is unpredictable. The important thing is you're here now. He glanced at Caleb, and something flickered across his face. Calculation, perhaps, or assessment. Morgan. Didn't expect to see you playing escort. Miss Hayes' stagecoach broke down on the mountain road, Caleb said evenly. She spent the night at my ranch under Mrs. Chen's supervision. I'm simply ensuring she arrives safely. The emphasis on Mrs. Chen's presence was deliberate, Eleanor realized, protecting her reputation before rumors could start. She filed that away too, another small kindness from a man who seemed to understand the particular vulnerabilities of a woman alone in a frontier town. Well, that was fortunate, Hartwell said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased. Come, Miss Hayes, let me show you the schoolhouse. We've prepared everything according to your specifications in your letters. Eleanor followed him inside, Caleb trailing behind at a respectful distance. The schoolhouse was exactly what she'd expected, a large open room with rough-hewn benches arranged in rows, a teacher's desk at the front, a blackboard that had seen better days, and shelves mostly empty of books. The floor was clean swept but scarred from years of hard use. Windows on both sides let in generous light. A pot-bellied stove in the corner would provide heat in winter. It was perfect. The town purchased 30 primers, 20 slates, and chalk as you requested, Hartwell said, gesturing to supplies stacked on a table. We also allocated funds for additional books, subject to your selection and council approval. That's generous, Eleanor said carefully. What's the budget? $50 for the year. Eleanor's heart sank. $50 wouldn't buy half the books she needed for a proper education, but she kept her expression neutral. Caleb had warned her not to fight every battle at once. I'll submit a list for your review, she said. When do I meet the students? Classes begin Monday. That gives you 3 days to settle in and prepare. Hartwell pulled out a pocket watch, consulting it with the air of a busy man. I've arranged for the ladies' auxiliary to stock your cottage with basic supplies. If you need anything else, the general store extends credit to the school teacher. Within reason, of course. Of course. Excellent. Then I'll leave you to get acquainted with your new domain. Hartwell headed for the door, pausing to shake Caleb's hand. Morgan, thank you for your assistance. I trust we'll see you at the council meeting Thursday? I'll be there. When Hartwell was gone, Eleanor walked slowly around the room, running her fingers over desks carved with initials and crude drawings. She could feel the ghosts of previous teachers in this space, their hopes, their frustrations, their ultimate defeats. 3 teachers in 4 years. All of them gone. She would not be the 4th. It's a good space, Caleb said quietly. Better than what most frontier towns manage. It's adequate. Eleanor stopped at the blackboard, picking up a piece of chalk and testing it. Soft, likely to break easily, but it would work. The question is whether the parents will send their children regularly enough for education to matter. That'll depend on you. Eleanor turned to face him. Meaning if you can prove to them that what you're teaching has value, real, practical value they can see, they'll send their children. But if it's all reading fancy books and learning things that don't matter to farming or mining or survival, they'll keep their kids home to work. Education always has value. I agree. But you'll need to show them that, not just tell them. Caleb moved to the window looking out at the town. The last teacher spent most of her time on poetry and penmanship. Beautiful stuff, I'm sure, but not useful to a miner's daughter who needs to calculate ore weights or a rancher's son who has to keep breeding records. Eleanor bristled at the implied criticism, then forced herself to actually hear what he was saying. It was the same advice he'd given at breakfast, just more specific. Practical application over theoretical knowledge. Show value before demanding respect. She hated that he was right. So you think I should teach arithmetic and practical writing instead of literature and history? I think you should teach everything, but lead with what matters to their lives right now. Once you've proven yourself useful, they'll trust you to teach the rest. Eleanor considered this, turning it over in her mind. It went against everything her Philadelphia education had taught her, that classical learning was the highest form of knowledge, that practical skills were merely vocational training. But Philadelphia was 2,000 miles away, and its values meant nothing here. All right, she said slowly. I'll start with practical applications, but I won't abandon the rest. These children deserve a full education, Mr. Morgan, not just enough to make them useful workers. I wouldn't expect anything less from you. Caleb moved toward the door. I should get back to the ranch. Will you be all right here? The question was genuine, not condescending. Eleanor appreciated that. I'll be fine. I have a cottage to explore and lessons to plan. If you need anything at all, send word to 3 Rivers. I'll come. Eleanor met his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. Why are you helping me, Mr. Morgan? You don't know me. I held you at gunpoint yesterday. Caleb smiled. Maybe that's exactly why. Anyone brave enough or foolish enough to fire a warning shot at a stranger, then spend the night at his ranch rather than die alone on a mountain road, that's someone who might actually last in this territory. And Redwood Crossing needs a teacher who will last. That's all? Civic duty? Something shifted in his expression, became more complicated. That's most of it. The rest is that I admire stubbornness when it's in service of something worthwhile. You could have taken an easy teaching position in some eastern city, married some safe man, lived a comfortable life. Instead, you came here, to one of the hardest places in America, because you wanted to make a difference. That takes courage. I respect courage. Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest, dangerous and unwelcome. Respect from men usually came with strings attached, expectations of gratitude, hints at future claims. But Caleb's respect seemed offered freely, with no demands implicit in the giving. Thank you, she said quietly, for the escort, the shelter, and the advice. I won't forget it. I hope not. Some of it might keep you alive. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell. Good luck, Miss Hayes. I suspect you're going to shake this town up considerably. That's the idea, Mr. Morgan. He left, and Eleanor was alone in her schoolhouse, surrounded by empty benches and infinite possibility. She stood there for a long moment, breathing in the smell of chalk dust and old wood, letting the reality of her new life settle into her bones. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The cottage was small but clean, furnished with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a stove. The ladies' auxiliary had indeed stocked it. Basic foodstuffs, firewood, linens that smelled of lavender. Eleanor unpacked her few personal possessions, hanging her 2 spare dresses on pegs, arranging her toiletries on a shelf, placing her mother's Bible on the bedside table. She didn't read it anymore. Hadn't since her father burned her mother's teaching books, but she kept it anyway. a reminder of what silence cost. Her trunk arrived mid-afternoon, delivered by two ranch hands who tipped their hats and departed without conversation. Eleanor dragged it inside and unpacked her most precious cargo, books. 37 volumes representing every cent she could spare over 5 years. Readers, grammars, mathematics texts, histories, a collection of Shakespeare, and her personal favorite, a leather-bound copy of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman that had cost her a week's wages. She arranged them carefully on the schoolhouse shelves, positioning them so sunlight wouldn't fade the spines. These books represented possibility, proof that knowledge could transform lives. If she could just get the children of Redwood Crossing to see that. A knock on the schoolhouse door interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor turned to find a woman standing in the doorway, tall, raw-boned, with work-hardened hands and eyes that assessed Eleanor with frank curiosity. "You're the new teacher." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "Eleanor Hayes, and you are?" "Martha Donovan. My husband runs cattle south of town. I've got 3 children who'll be in your classroom, ages 7, 9, and 12. She stepped inside without invitation, looking around with the air of someone taking inventory. "You plan to stick around longer than the last one?" Eleanor appreciated the directness. "I plan to stay as long as Redwood Crossing needs a teacher." "That's not what I asked." "It's the only answer I have, Mrs. Donovan. I can't predict the future. I can only tell you my intentions." Martha studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. I'll tell you straight. My kids need proper learning. The boys need reading and ciphering to run the ranch someday. My daughter needs enough education to have choices beyond marrying the first man who asks. Can you give them that? I can teach them to read, write, calculate, think critically, and understand the world beyond Redwood Crossing," Eleanor said. "Whether that translates to the opportunities you want for them depends on how hard they're willing to work and how consistently you send them to school. They'll be there every day unless they're sick or we're branding. I don't hold with keeping kids home for small things." "Then we'll get along fine, Mrs. Donovan." Another assessing look, then Martha's stern expression cracked into something almost like a smile. "Maybe we will. Fair warning, not everyone in town thinks like me. Some folks believe girls don't need schooling or that book learning makes children dissatisfied with frontier life. You'll have opposition. I've had opposition my entire life, Mrs. Donovan. I'm still here." "Good. We'll see if that spine is as strong as it looks." Martha moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. Caleb Morgan brought you into town this morning." Eleanor tensed, waiting for whatever gossip or judgment was coming. "That's in your favor?" Martha continued. "Caleb's respected here. If he vouches for you, people will give you a chance. Don't waste it." "I don't intend to." Martha left, and Eleanor returned to arranging her classroom, but the conversation lingered in her mind. So much of her success here would depend on navigating social dynamics she barely understood. In Philadelphia, she'd known the rules, invisible and restrictive, but knowable. Here, everything was different. Respect had to be earned through demonstration rather than breeding. Reputation mattered more than family name. And apparently, being escorted into town by Caleb Morgan carried weight she hadn't anticipated. She would need to be careful about that. Eleanor had no intention of trading one form of dependence for another, even if the man offering help seemed genuinely decent. Over the next 2 days, Eleanor threw herself into preparation. She visited the general store and introduced herself to the owner, a shrewd-eyed man named Patterson, who seemed to measure her worth by how many supplies she purchased. She walked the town, noting the saloons that would compete for her students' father's attention, the boarding house where miners lived in shifts, the church that stood empty except on Sundays. She cataloged everything, looking for leverage points and potential obstacles. The town council met Thursday evening, and Eleanor attended uninvited, standing in the back of the room while Hartwell and 6 other men discussed water rights, mining claims, and town improvements. Caleb was there, as he'd promised, contributing occasionally with the same measured thoughtfulness she'd noticed before. He saw her but didn't acknowledge her presence beyond a slight nod, and Eleanor appreciated his discretion. When the formal business concluded, Hartwell noticed her. "Miss Hayes, did you have something to bring before the council?" Every eye turned toward her. Eleanor felt the weight of their scrutiny, testing, judging, waiting to see if she'd fold under attention. She walked to the front of the room, her back straight, her voice steady. "Gentlemen, I wanted to introduce myself formally and outline my intentions for the school. I know Redwood Crossing has struggled to keep teachers in the past. I want to assure you that I'm committed to staying and building something lasting." "That's what they all say," someone muttered. Eleanor ignored the interruption. "I also wanted to request permission to expand the school's hours. I'd like to offer evening classes for adults, reading, writing, and arithmetic for anyone who missed the opportunity for education as a child." The room erupted in conversation. Hartwell raised his hand for silence. "That's an unusual request, Miss Hayes. The town pays you to teach children, not grown men." "The town pays me to improve literacy and education," Eleanor corrected gently. "Whether that's for an 8-year-old learning to read or a 40-year-old minor learning to calculate his earnings fairly. I'm offering to do this at no additional cost to the town. I simply need permission to use the schoolhouse 3 evenings a week." Caleb leaned forward. "It's a good idea. Half the men in this territory can't read a contract or tally a claim properly. They get cheated because they don't have the skills to protect themselves. If Miss Hayes is willing to teach them, we should let her." "But a woman teaching grown men?" Another council member frowned. "It's not proper." "Neither is illiteracy," Caleb replied. "And I'd rather have impropriety than ignorance. Miss Hayes has already demonstrated she can handle herself. I trust her to manage a classroom of adults." The casual confidence in his support steadied Eleanor more than she wanted to admit. She kept her expression neutral, waiting while the council debated. Finally, Hartwell called for a vote. It passed, 5-2. "You have your permission, Miss Hayes," Hartwell said. "Though I'll warn you, if there's any trouble, any impropriety, the evening classes will be shut down immediately." "Understood. Thank you, gentlemen." Eleanor left before they could ask questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Outside, the mountain air was cool and sharp with the promise of autumn. She breathed deeply, letting the small victories settle into her bones. It wasn't everything she wanted, but it was a start. Footsteps behind her. She turned to find Caleb approaching, his hat in his hands. "That was well done," he said. "That was you defending me when you didn't have to." "I defended a good idea that benefits the town. There's a difference." Eleanor smiled despite herself. "Is there?" It seemed fairly personal from where I was standing. Caleb met her eyes, and for a moment something passed between them. Acknowledgement of the careful dance they were doing, the way he was helping without claiming, supporting without controlling. It was so different from what Eleanor expected from men that she didn't quite know how to process it. "I should go," she said, before the moment could become something more complicated. "Eleanor." Her name on his lips stopped her. "You're going to do well here. I wanted you to know that I believe that." "How can you be sure? You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you don't quit when things get hard. I know you're smart enough to listen to advice without being too proud to ignore it when it's wrong. I know you care about these children's futures more than you care about being comfortable. That's enough." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a tiny crack in the armor she'd spent years building. It would be so easy to rely on his support, to let herself believe that someone else could share the burden she'd carried alone for so long. But she'd learned the hard way that depending on anyone, even someone who seemed genuinely good, was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But I need to succeed on my own terms, Mr. Morgan, not because you vouched for me." "I know that too." He replaced his hat, tipping it slightly. "Good night, Miss Hayes." "Good night." She watched him walk away, back to his horse, back to his ranch, back to a life that had nothing to do with hers beyond the occasional intersection of community and circumstance. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt oddly like loss. Eleanor shook off the feeling and returned to her cottage. She had lessons to plan, a classroom to finalize, and 24 hours before 30 children would test every skill she possessed. There was no time for complicated feelings about men who respected her independence even while offering support. There was only the work. She worked through the night, oil lamp burning low while she organized lessons, prepared materials, and rehearsed her opening remarks. When dawn broke over the mountains, Eleanor was ready. The children began arriving just before 8, accompanied by parents who wanted to assess the new teacher. Eleanor greeted each family at the door, learning names, noting which children seemed eager and which looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Martha Donovan's three arrived clean and ready, earning their mother's firm nod of approval. Other families were less prepared, children in ill-fitting clothes, some without proper shoes, a few who clearly hadn't eaten breakfast. Eleanor made mental notes of everything. These weren't just students, they were windows into the community's struggles and priorities. When the schoolhouse was full, 28 children by her count, not 30 but close enough, Eleanor stood before them and let the weight of the moment settle. This was it. Everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd traveled for came down to this room full of children who didn't yet know she was about to change their lives. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the back benches. "My name is Miss Hayes, and I'm your new teacher. I know some of you are wondering if I'll last longer than the others. I know some of you are here because your parents made you come, not because you want to learn, and I know some of you think school is a waste of time that could be better spent working." The honesty rippled through the room. Children sat straighter, surprised. "I'm going to tell you the truth," Eleanor continued. "School is hard. Learning is hard. And yes, sometimes it will feel like a waste when you could be doing something more immediately useful. But I'm going to prove to you that education is the most valuable thing you'll ever receive. Not because I say so, but because you'll see it for yourselves." She moved to the blackboard, picking up chalk. "Today, we're going to start with something practical. How many of you have parents who work in mining?" Most of the hands went up. "And how many of those parents have ever been cheated on their wages because they couldn't calculate the value of their work?" The hands stayed up, more slowly this time, but with understanding dawning on young faces. "That," Eleanor said, "is why we learn mathematics. Not to solve pretty problems in a book, but to protect yourselves and your families from people who would take advantage of your ignorance. By the end of this year, every one of you will be able to calculate wages, measure ore weights, figure percentages, and understand enough arithmetic that no one can cheat you. Ever." She had their attention now, complete and absolute. "We'll also learn to read and write, not just for pleasure, though stories are wonderful, but so you can read contracts before you sign them, write letters that communicate clearly, and understand the laws that govern this territory. Knowledge is protection. Education is power, and I'm going to give you both." A small girl in the front row raised her hand tentatively. "Even girls?" Eleanor crouched down to the child's eye level. "Especially girls. Because girls who can read and calculate and think for themselves get to choose their futures instead of accepting whatever someone else decides for them. Do you understand?" The girl nodded, eyes wide. Eleanor stood, surveying her classroom. "We start now. Get out your slates. We're going to learn how to calculate mining wages, and by lunch, every one of you will be able to tell your fathers if they're being paid fairly." The room erupted into activity, slates clattering, chalk distributing, children leaning forward with the first genuine interest Eleanor had seen all morning. She smiled, sharp and satisfied. This was going to work. This was going to change everything. The first week passed in a blur of chalk dust and children's voices, of small victories and stubborn resistance. Eleanor discovered quickly that reaching these frontier children required a different approach than anything her Philadelphia training had prepared her for. They were practical to their bones, skeptical of abstractions, and merciless in their assessment of whether something was worth their time. But they were also hungry in ways city children never were. Hungry for knowledge that had real power, for skills that could change their circumstances, for proof that the world extended beyond these mountains and mining claims. Eleanor gave them that proof, one lesson at a time. By Friday afternoon, 12 children could calculate percentages well enough to check their father's wages. By the following Wednesday, half the class could write clear, grammatically correct sentences explaining mining procedures. And by the end of the second week, even the most resistant students had stopped looking at the door like prisoners counting minutes until freedom. The evening classes started that Tuesday, and Eleanor wasn't sure anyone would come. She'd posted notices at the general store and both saloons, advertising free instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic for adults. Patterson at the store had looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Men around here don't take kindly to being told they need schooling," he'd warned. "You'll be lucky if 3 show up, and luckier still if they don't cause trouble." Eleanor had smiled her sharpest smile. Then I'll teach 3. And if they cause trouble, I'll handle it the same way I handled that broken stagecoach wheel, with a rifle and clear expectations. Patterson had laughed despite himself. You're either crazy or brilliant, Miss Hayes. Haven't decided which yet. Why not both? 7 men showed up that first Tuesday evening, shuffling into the schoolhouse with the awkward defiance of people doing something they half believed was beneath them. Eleanor recognized 2 from town, miners who drank at the Silver Dollar Saloon and had the weathered look of men who'd spent their lives underground. The others were strangers, faces she hadn't yet memorized from her careful study of Redwood Crossing's inhabitants. She treated them exactly as she treated the children, with respect and clear expectations. Gentlemen, thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy. Admitting you need help with something never is. But you're here, which means you're smart enough to recognize that ignorance costs money and opportunity. We're going to fix that. No judgment, no shame, just learning. Understood? They nodded, wary but willing. Eleanor started with basic letter recognition, moving quickly through the alphabet while watching their faces for signs of comprehension or frustration. 2 of the men already knew their letters but couldn't string them into words. 3 knew nothing at all and struggled to hold the chalk correctly. The remaining 2 fell somewhere in between, their knowledge patchy and inconsistent. She adjusted on the fly, the way she'd learned to do with the children, tailoring instruction to individual needs while keeping everyone moving forward together. It was exhausting work, requiring every ounce of focus and patience she possessed. But when one of the miners, a grizzled man named Cooper, who'd spent 40 years underground, successfully read his first complete sentence aloud, his face transformed with something close to wonder, Eleanor felt a surge of satisfaction so intense it was almost painful. This was why she'd come west, not for comfort or safety or even respect, but for these moments when knowledge cracked open a new possibility in someone's mind. The men left at 9, tired but noticeably less defensive than when they'd arrived. Cooper paused at the door. Miss Hayes, I just wanted to say, well, thank you. My boy's been trying to teach me letters for years, but I was too proud to admit I needed it. But you made it seem like it ain't shameful, just practical. I appreciate that. Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest. Learning is never shameful, Mr. Cooper. Teaching is my privilege. He ducked his head and left, and Eleanor locked the schoolhouse door behind him, leaning against it for a moment in the sudden silence. Her feet ached, her voice was hoarse, and she had another full day of teaching children ahead of her tomorrow. But she was building something here, something that might actually last. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice Caleb Morgan standing in the shadows across the street until he stepped into the lamplight. Evening, Miss Hayes. Eleanor's hand flew to her chest. You nearly gave me a heart condition, Mr. Morgan. What are you doing lurking in the dark? Not lurking, waiting. I wanted to make sure your evening class didn't cause problems. He moved closer, his face concerned in the dim light. How did it go? 7 students, all respectful, all willing to learn. Why would there be problems? Caleb's expression turned grim. Because some men in this town don't like the idea of a woman teaching other men. And some don't like the idea of miners and ranch hands getting educated enough to question their wages or their contracts. Hartwell, for instance, wasn't happy when he heard about tonight. Eleanor's spine stiffened. Hartwell approved the evening classes himself. He can't object now. He can object all he wants in private while smiling in public. That's how men like him operate. Caleb paused, seeming to weigh his words. I'm not trying to frighten you, Eleanor. I'm trying to warn you. You're challenging the established order here, and that makes some people nervous. It was the first time he'd used her given name without the formal miss, and Eleanor noticed the intimacy of it even as she processed his warning. She should have corrected him, re-established the professional distance they'd maintained since that first ride into town 3 weeks ago. Instead, she found herself responding with equal informality. Let them be nervous, Caleb. I didn't come here to make people comfortable. I came here to teach, and I'll keep teaching until someone physically removes me from that schoolhouse. And even then, I'll probably keep teaching from wherever they put me next. He smiled at that, genuine and warm. I believe you would. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. I prefer determined. Call it what you like. It's what's going to keep you alive out here. He glanced up at the stars, brilliant in the clear mountain sky. It's late. Let me walk you home. I'm perfectly capable of walking 50 yards by myself. I know, but I'd sleep better knowing you got there safely. Humor me. There was something in his tone that made Eleanor pause, something beyond simple courtesy. She studied his face in the lamplight, noting the tension around his eyes, the way he stood slightly angled toward her cottage, as if already anticipating the walk. Is there something you're not telling me? She asked quietly. Caleb hesitated, then sighed. There have been men at the Silver Dollar tonight, drinking hard and talking harder about the new teacher who thinks she can reform the whole town. Most of it's just talk, the kind that evaporates with sobriety. But one of them, fellow named Gideon Brock, he's got a mean streak and a grudge against education. Lost a mining claim last year because he signed a contract he couldn't read. Blames the man who wrote it instead of his own ignorance. And you think he'll blame me for teaching people to read contracts? I think he's drunk and angry and looking for someone to punish for his mistakes. I'd rather not give him an opportunity to find you alone in the dark. Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist she could handle one drunk miner with a grudge. But she'd learned over the past weeks that Caleb didn't exaggerate threats or coddle her unnecessarily. If he was concerned enough to wait outside the schoolhouse, the situation merited caution. All right, she said, but only because I don't want to waste energy fighting you when I might need it for actually dangerous people. They walked in silence, Caleb matching his longer stride to her pace. Eleanor was acutely aware of his presence beside her, solid, protective without being possessive, alert to their surroundings in a way that suggested real vigilance rather than performance. She'd noticed this about him over their limited interactions these past weeks. He carried competence like some men carried weapons, quiet and ready. How's the teaching going otherwise? He asked as they reached her cottage door. Besides the evening classes. Better than expected. The children are responding well to practical applications of learning. I've had 3 sets of parents tell me their children caught arithmetic errors in family accounts this week. That's impressive. That's the point. Education should be immediately useful, not just preparation for some distant future that might never come. Eleanor paused, her hand on the door latch. Thank you for the escort, and for the warning. Any time. Caleb tipped his hat but didn't move away. Eleanor, I know you value your independence. I respect that. But if you ever need help, if Brock or anyone else causes trouble, send word to the ranch. I can be here in under an hour. I can take care of myself. I know you can, but you shouldn't have to. Not all the time, not alone. His gray eyes were serious in the moonlight. There's no shame in accepting help when you genuinely need it. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Eleanor felt something dangerous stir in her chest, gratitude mixed with something warmer, more complicated. She'd spent so long being entirely self-reliant that the idea of sharing burdens felt almost foreign. But Caleb wasn't offering to carry her burdens for her. He was offering to stand beside her while she carried them herself. The distinction mattered. I'll keep that in mind, she said softly. Good night, Caleb. Good night, Eleanor. She went inside and locked the door, then stood in the darkness listening to his footsteps fade down the street toward wherever he'd left his horse. Only when she could no longer hear him did she light her lamp and begin preparing tomorrow's lessons, pushing away thoughts of gray eyes and steady hands and the unfamiliar feeling of being supported rather than rescued. The encounter with Gideon Brock came sooner than Eleanor expected, on a Saturday afternoon when the town was busy with weekend commerce and she was returning from the general store with supplies for Monday's science demonstration. She had her arms full of jars and twine when a man stepped directly into her path, forcing her to stop or collide with him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that might have been handsome if it weren't twisted by bitterness and drink. His clothes were decent enough, no miner's rags, but not prosperity either, and his eyes held the particular rage of someone who'd convinced himself the world owed him more than he'd received. You're the teacher, he said. Not a question. Eleanor kept her voice level. I am. Eleanor Hayes, and you are? Gideon Brock. Heard you're teaching minors to read. I'm teaching anyone who wants to learn, reading, writing, arithmetic, free of charge, 3 evenings a week. Real charitable of you. His tone made charity sound like an insult. Never mind that you're filling men's heads with ideas above their station, making them think they're smart enough to question their betters. Eleanor felt anger kindle in her chest, hot and immediate. But she'd learned years ago that showing anger to men like this only gave them power. Instead, she smiled, sharp as broken glass. I'm not making anyone think anything, Mr. Brock. I'm simply providing information. What they do with that information is their choice. If their betters are threatened by educated workers, perhaps those betters should examine why their authority depends on other people's ignorance. Brock's face darkened. You got a smart mouth for a woman. I have an educated mouth, Mr. Brock. There's a difference. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. She moved a step around him, but he shifted to block her path again. The jars in her arms clinked together, and Eleanor tightened her grip to keep from dropping them. I don't excuse you, Brock said, his voice dropping to something uglier. I think you need a lesson in knowing your place. Women who get too big for themselves need taking down a notch or two. And you think you're the man to teach me? Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. Here's the problem with that, Mr. Brock. I've dealt with men like you my entire life, men who mistake cruelty for strength and think threatening women makes them powerful. It doesn't. It makes you pathetic. The slap came fast, hard enough to snap her head sideways and send the jars crashing to the ground. Glass shattered, scattering across the dirt street. Pain exploded across Eleanor's cheek, sharp and stunning. She stumbled, but didn't fall, years of practice keeping her upright through worse blows than this. Around them, the street had gone silent. People stopped, stared, but no one moved to help. Eleanor could feel their eyes, weighing, judging, deciding whether a schoolteacher was worth defending against a man with Brock's reputation for violence. She touched her cheek, felt wetness, realized he'd split her lip, blood copper bright on her tongue. The world had gone very sharp and clear, the way it always did when violence arrived. You just made a mistake, Eleanor said quietly. Brock laughed. What are you going to do, teacher? Throw a book at me? No, I'm going to press charges with the sheriff and testify at your trial. Assault and battery witnessed by... She glanced around, counting faces. At least 20 people. That's 60 days in territorial jail, minimum. The laughter died on Brock's face. No one here's going to testify against me. I only need one, Mr. Brock, and I suspect I'll find several who are tired of watching you terrorize this town without consequences. You uppity bitch! He raised his hand again, and this time Eleanor was ready. She stepped back, creating distance, her hand moving to the small knife she kept in her skirt pocket. Not to use, but to show. A reminder that she wasn't helpless, wasn't prey. Touch me again and I'll defend myself, she said clearly, loudly enough for everyone watching to hear. Legally and justifiably. Test me if you want, but know that I don't bluff and I don't back down. Brock froze, his hand still raised, rage and calculation warring across his face. Eleanor held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to give ground. The moment stretched, taut as wire. Then hoofbeats, fast and urgent. A horse slid to a stop between them, and Caleb Morgan swung down from the saddle with a fury Eleanor had never seen in him before. His face was carved from stone, his eyes chips of winter ice. Brock! The name came out like a curse. Step away from her, now! This ain't your business, Morgan. You just made it my business when you put your hands on a woman in my town. Caleb moved forward, placing himself directly between Eleanor and Brock. I saw what you did. So did half of Redwood Crossing. You want to press this? We can settle it right now. There was something in Caleb's stance that spoke of absolute certainty. Not bravado, not threat, but simple fact. If Brock wanted a fight, Caleb would give him one, and only one of them would walk away whole. Brock must have seen it too because he backed down, hands rising in mock surrender. Just having a conversation with the teacher, no harm meant. You split her lip, that's harm. And it's assault. Caleb's voice was ice cold. You've got two choices, Brock. Apologize to Miss Hayes right now and promise you'll never come near her again or deal with me. Decide quick, because my patience just ran out. Eleanor watched Brock's face work through humiliation and fury before he finally spat out something that might have been an apology to someone deaf and generous. Then he turned and stalked away, shoving through the crowd that had gathered. Caleb immediately turned to Eleanor, his anger transforming into concern. Are you all right? Let me see. I'm fine. Eleanor's voice came out shakier than she intended. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her trembling and furious at her own weakness. It's just a split lip. It's assault, and you were right to say so. Caleb's hand hovered near her face, wanting to check the injury but not quite touching without permission. We need to get you to the doctor. I don't need a doctor for a split lip. I need... Eleanor stopped, suddenly unsure what she needed. To sit down, to scream, to prove to everyone still watching that she wasn't broken, wasn't defeated, wasn't going to run. You need to let someone help you, Caleb said quietly. Just for a moment. Just right now. Then you can go back to being invincible, I promise. The gentleness in his voice broke something loose in Eleanor's chest. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and let him guide her to his horse. He lifted her into the saddle. She was too shaky to mount herself, then swung up behind her, one arm around her waist to keep her steady. I'm taking you to Doc Morrison to get that cleaned properly, he said. Don't argue. Eleanor didn't have the energy to argue. She leaned back against his chest and let him take control, just this once, just until the shaking stopped. Doc Morrison's office was above the general store, a cramped room that smelled of carbolic and whiskey. The doctor was a small man with quick, competent hands and eyes that had seen too much suffering to be surprised by anything. He cleaned Eleanor's split lip with efficient gentleness while Caleb stood in the corner, radiating barely suppressed fury. You'll bruise, Morrison said finally, and the lip will take a week to heal properly. Don't eat anything too hot or acidic, and try not to talk more than necessary for a few days. Eleanor nearly laughed at that last instruction. Not talk when she had a classroom full of children who needed teaching? I'll do my best, she said instead. Morrison glanced at Caleb. You filing charges? That's up to Miss Hayes. Both men looked at her, and Eleanor felt the weight of the decision. Filing charges would mean publicity, testimony, a trial that would put her in the center of town drama. It would also mean justice, consequences, a clear message that violence against women wouldn't be tolerated. I'll think about it, she said carefully. I want to talk to the sheriff first, understand what the process involves. Morrison nodded. Smart. Don't let anyone pressure you either way. This is your decision. When they left the doctor's office, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of copper and blood. Eleanor stood on the wooden sidewalk, looking at the town that had seemed so full of possibility 3 weeks ago and now felt considerably more complicated. I should have been there sooner, Caleb said quietly. I saw Brock heading your direction and got a bad feeling, but I didn't move fast enough. You couldn't have known he'd actually strike me. Most men threaten without following through. Most men aren't Brock. I should have remembered that. He turned to face her fully, his expression pained. Eleanor, I'm sorry. This town should be better than this. You deserve better than this. What I deserve and what I get are rarely the same thing, Caleb. I stopped expecting fairness a long time ago. Eleanor touched her swollen lip gingerly. But I won't let this stop me. Brock wants me afraid, wants me to quit, wants to prove that a woman can't survive here without male protection. I won't give him that satisfaction. You're planning to continue the evening classes. Of course I am. Canceling would prove I'm exactly what he thinks. Too weak to follow through on my commitments. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving across his face. You're remarkable, you know that? Most people would use this as an excuse to retreat, to protect themselves. But you're planning to walk straight back into potential danger because you won't let a bully win. Not a bully. Multiple bullies. Brock is just the one willing to use his fists. But Hartwell undermines me in council meetings. Patterson questions my purchases at the store. Half the parents in this town think I'm filling their children's heads with dangerous ideas. If I retreat every time someone opposes me, I might as well pack my trunk and leave now. And you won't do that. I can't do that. Eleanor's voice caught slightly. This town, this school, these children, they're all I have. I burned every bridge to get here. There's nowhere else to go, no family to return to, no safety net waiting. I either succeed here or I fail completely. Those are my only options. She hadn't meant to reveal quite that much, but exhaustion and shock had loosened her usual careful control. Caleb's expression softened into something that looked dangerously like tenderness. Then you won't fail, he said simply. Because I won't let you, and more importantly, you won't let yourself. You're too stubborn for failure. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry, not here, not where people might see and interpret it as weakness. Thank you, she whispered, for coming when you did, for standing between us. She gestured helplessly, unable to articulate the complex gratitude she felt. For doing what any decent person should do when they see someone being hurt? Caleb shook his head. That's just basic humanity, Eleanor. You shouldn't have to thank me for it. And yet I do, because basic humanity is surprisingly rare when it requires any actual courage. They stood in silence for a moment, the space between them charged with things unsaid. Finally, Caleb cleared his throat. I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly without worrying about offending me. Eleanor braced herself. All right. Would you feel safer if I stayed in town tonight? Not in your cottage, he added quickly. I'd take a room at the boarding house, but I'd be close if Brock or anyone else decided to cause more trouble. Part of Eleanor wanted to say yes immediately, to accept the comfort of knowing someone capable and trustworthy was nearby. But another part, the part that had kept her alive and independent for 28 years, recoiled at the idea of needing protection. I appreciate the offer, she said carefully, but I think staying would send the wrong message. It would suggest I can't handle myself, that I need a man to defend me. That's exactly the narrative Brock wants to establish. Caleb nodded slowly. I understand, but promise me something. What? Promise you'll keep your rifle loaded and close. And if anything at all, feels wrong tonight, you fire a shot out your window. Someone will hear it and come running. I promise. And promise you'll actually fire it, not just think about it. Your safety is more important than worrying about causing a fuss. Eleanor managed a small smile despite her swollen lip. You really don't know me very well if you think I'd hesitate to cause a fuss when my safety is threatened. That surprised a laugh out of him, brief but genuine. Fair point. All right, I'll head back to the ranch. But I'm riding into town Tuesday for the council meeting, and I'll make sure to arrive early enough to check on you first. That's not necessary. Humor me. Again. Eleanor sighed but nodded. Fighting every battle was exhausting, and this one seemed harmless enough. Fine. Tuesday afternoon you can check on me, but I'll be perfectly fine and you'll have wasted a trip into town early. I hope you're right. Caleb touched the brim of his hat. Good night, Eleanor. Lock your doors. Good night, Caleb. She watched him ride away into the gathering darkness, then made her way back to her cottage. True to his instructions, she locked both doors, loaded her rifle, and placed it within arm's reach of her bed. Then she sat at her small table and forced herself to finish planning Monday's lessons, refusing to let Brock's violence derail her work. But her hands shook slightly as she wrote, and the words blurred occasionally when unwelcome tears escaped despite her best efforts. She was strong, determined, capable of handling whatever frontier life threw at her. She was also, for the first time in weeks, genuinely afraid. The fear didn't last. By morning, Eleanor had transformed it into something harder and more useful, resolve edged with fury. She taught her Monday classes with a bruised face and split lip that made several children gasp when they saw her, and she used their shock as a teaching moment about violence, justice, and why education mattered in a world where some men believed might made right. This, she said, gesturing to her injured face, is what happens when people fear knowledge. When they're threatened by the idea that everyone deserves access to information and the power that comes with it. A man hit me because he doesn't want you or your parents learning to read and calculate and think for yourselves. The question is, are you going to let his fear stop you, or are you going to prove him wrong by learning everything you possibly can? The children learned with a ferocity that day that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. Even the most resistant students bent over their slates with new determination, as if good penmanship and accurate arithmetic could somehow avenge the violence done to their teacher. Martha Donovan appeared at lunch with a basket of food and a face like thunderclouds. Heard what happened, she said without preamble, setting the basket on Eleanor's desk. Also heard you're planning to continue the evening classes despite Brock's warning. It wasn't a warning, it was assault. And yes, I'm continuing. Tomorrow night, same as planned. Martha studied her for a long moment, then nodded with grim satisfaction. Good. My husband and I will be attending. Bill needs help with his reading, and I never learned proper grammar. Figure it's time we fixed that. Eleanor felt something warm bloom in her chest. Mrs. Donovan, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. And more than that, this town needs to see that decent people support what you're doing. Brock's got friends, but he's also got plenty of folks who are tired of his bullying. Time someone stood up to him publicly. That could make things difficult for your family. Everything worthwhile is difficult, Miss Hayes. You taught me that when you showed up here with a split lip and taught anyway. Least I can do is sit in a classroom for a few hours a week. After Martha left, 3 more parents arrived separately, each offering some version of the same message. They supported Eleanor, they'd be attending evening classes, and they wouldn't let Brock's violence go unanswered. By the time school ended, Eleanor had commitments from 15 adult students for Tuesday night, more than double her previous attendance. Brock had meant to intimidate her into submission. Instead, he'd created exactly the opposition he'd feared. Tuesday's council meeting was tense from the opening gavel. Caleb arrived early as promised, checking on Eleanor with eyes that assessed her healing injuries before relaxing slightly. The bruise on her face had darkened to purple and yellow, impossible to hide, and she caught several council members staring before quickly looking away. Hartwell called the meeting to order with his usual politician smile, but his eyes were cold when they landed on Eleanor sitting in her customary spot at the back of the room. Before we begin regular business, he said, I think we need to address the incident on Saturday involving Miss Hayes and Mr. Brock. It's created considerable discussion in town. Discussion? Caleb's voice cut through the room like a blade. That's an interesting way to describe a man assaulting a woman in broad daylight in front of witnesses. Now, Morgan, let's not be dramatic. There was an altercation, certainly, but there was a crime. Caleb stood, and Eleanor noticed how the other council members shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but attentive. Gideon Brock struck Miss Hayes hard enough to split her lip and bruise her face. That's assault and battery under territorial law. The only question is whether this council will support prosecuting him or whether we're going to send a message that violence against women is acceptable in Redwood Crossing. No one's saying it's acceptable, another council member interjected, but we also need to consider the broader implications. Brock employs 12 men at his operation. If we press charges and he leaves town, that's 12 families without income. Eleanor couldn't stay silent any longer. She rose, feeling every eye turned toward her. Councilman, I appreciate Mr. Morgan's defense, but I can speak for myself. Yes, Gideon Brock assaulted me. Yes, I have every legal right to press charges. But I've spent the last 3 days considering what outcome would actually serve justice, rather than just satisfying my desire for revenge. Hartwell's eyebrows rose. You're saying you won't press charges? I'm saying I'll offer Mr. Brock a choice. He can face trial and almost certain conviction given the number of witnesses, which would mean 60 days in territorial jail and a permanent mark on his record. Or he can make a public apology, pay a fine to be donated to the school for books and supplies, and commit in writing to never interfering with my teaching or my students again. If he violates that commitment, then I press charges with the full weight of territorial law behind me. The room erupted in conversation. Caleb looked stunned. Whether with admiration or disagreement, Eleanor couldn't tell. Hartwell banged his gavel for silence. That's a very generous offer, Miss Hayes. Some might say too generous. Some might say it's strategic, Eleanor countered. I don't want Brock in jail. I want him neutralized as a threat and turned into an example of what happens when you try to stop education through violence. A public apology and a financial penalty accomplish that better than imprisonment. They demonstrate that attacking a teacher costs you money and reputation, not just freedom. One of the other council members leaned forward. And if Brock refuses your terms? Then I press charges immediately and testify at his trial. But I'm betting he'll take the deal. Men like Brock care more about their pride and their pocketbook than about principle. Admitting he was wrong will cost him pride. The fine will cost him money. Together, they'll hurt worse than 60 days in a cell where he can play the martyr. Caleb was smiling now, a fierce expression that suggested he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about Eleanor Hayes. Hartwell looked less pleased. I'll convey your offer to Mr. Brock. But Miss Hayes, I hope you understand that this kind of leniency might be interpreted as weakness. Only by people who don't understand the difference between mercy and strategy, Mr. Hartwell. I know which one I'm deploying. The question is whether you do. She sat down before he could respond, heart hammering but expression calm. Around her, she could feel the mood in the room shift. She just outmaneuvered the council chairman in front of his peers, and everyone knew it. The meeting continued with routine business, but Eleanor barely heard it. Her attention was focused on Caleb, who caught her eye once and gave a small, approving nod that made warmth spread through her chest, in ways that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with the way he looked at her, like she was something rare and worth protecting, but also fully capable of protecting herself. After the meeting adjourned, Caleb intercepted her outside. "That was brilliant," he said without preamble. "You turned Brock's assault into a teachable moment for the whole town about consequences and accountability." "I turned it into a survival strategy," Eleanor corrected. "If I'd pushed for prosecution, half the town would have seen me as vindictive. This way, I look reasonable while still extracting a penalty that serves my actual goals, funding for books, and a written commitment that protects my students. You've thought this through from every angle." "I've had to. Women don't get to make careless decisions, Caleb. Every choice I make is scrutinized, judged, and used as evidence for or against my competence. So, yes, I think things through. It's how I stay alive." Caleb's expression turned serious. "You shouldn't have to calculate every move like you're playing chess with your life as the stakes." "But I do, and I will, because that's reality. The frontier might be more egalitarian than Philadelphia in some ways, but it's still a man's world. I'm just learning how to navigate it without compromising who I am." They walked in silence toward her cottage, the evening air cool and sharp with the promise of autumn. Above them, stars were beginning to emerge, brilliant against the darkening sky. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said as they reached her door. "You can ask. I may not answer." "Why teaching? With your intelligence and determination, you could have done anything. Why choose one of the hardest, most underpaid, least respected professions available to women?" Eleanor considered the question, surprised by its sincerity. Most people who asked about her career choice were really asking why she wasn't married, why she'd wasted her potential on children instead of supporting a husband. "Because teaching is power," she said finally. "Not the kind of power men usually recognize, not authority or control or dominance, but the power to change how people think, to give them tools they can use to change their own lives. My mother couldn't teach me openly, couldn't give me the education I deserved because my father controlled everything. But the knowledge she did manage to pass on, the skills I learned in secret, those changed my life. They gave me choices. I want to give other people choices too, especially girls who might otherwise grow up thinking their only option is to marry whoever asks and hope for the best." "Your mother would be proud of you." Eleanor's throat tightened. "My mother died thinking I'd failed. She got sick when I was 23, and by then I was working as a maid while studying teaching in secret. She never knew I passed the examination, never knew I'd become what she'd tried to help me be. She died believing her sacrifice was for nothing. It wasn't for nothing. Look at what you're doing, Eleanor. Look at the lives you're changing. Your mother's sacrifice is alive in every child who learns to read because you taught them." A tear escaped down Eleanor's cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away angrily, frustrated by the display of emotion. "I'm sorry," Caleb said quietly. "I didn't mean to upset you." "You didn't. I'm just tired and my lip hurts, and sometimes the weight of everything I'm trying to accomplish feels crushing." She forced a smile. "I'll be fine. I always am." "You don't always have to be fine, Eleanor. You're allowed to hurt, to be tired, to feel overwhelmed. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." There was something in his voice, in the gentle certainty of his words, that made Eleanor's carefully constructed defenses crack just slightly. For 3 weeks she'd been performing strength, demonstrating competence, proving she belonged in this frontier town that didn't quite know what to do with a woman like her. And here was Caleb Morgan, one of the most respected men in Redwood Crossing, telling her she didn't have to perform for him. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saying that, for seeing that. I see you, Eleanor Hayes, all of you. The strength and the vulnerability, the brilliance and the fear, the determination and the exhaustion. And I think you're remarkable, all of it, no performance necessary. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Eleanor knew she should step back, reestablish boundaries, remind both of them that she couldn't afford complications. But she was so tired of being alone, of carrying everything herself, of pretending invulnerability when she felt anything but. "I should go inside," she said, not moving. "You should," Caleb agreed, also not moving. "The evening class starts in an hour. I need to prepare." "You're already prepared. You've been prepared since before you arrived in Redwood Crossing." Eleanor laughed shakily. "You have a lot of faith in me for someone who's only known me a month." "I've known you long enough to see who you are. That's sufficient." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed his thumb gently across her uninjured cheek. The touch was feather-light, respectful, and it sent electricity racing through Eleanor's nervous system. "Caleb, I know this is complicated. I know you didn't come here looking for this. I know you need to focus on teaching and establishing yourself. I'm not asking for anything, Eleanor. I just needed you to know that I see you, I admire you, and when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'm here." Then he stepped back, tipped his hat, and walked away before Eleanor could formulate a response. She stood frozen on her doorstep, heart racing, mind spinning with implications and possibilities and fears. Caleb Morgan had just declared his interest without demanding anything in return, had offered support without expecting surrender, had seen her completely and decided she was worth pursuing. It was everything she'd never let herself want and everything she was terrified to accept. The evening class was larger than ever, 15 adults plus Caleb, who slipped in quietly at the back and pulled out a slate like any other student. Eleanor nearly stopped mid-sentence when she saw him, but recovered and continued her lesson on basic grammar. If he wanted to attend her class, fine. She'd treat him exactly like everyone else, except she was acutely aware of his presence for the entire 2 hours, of his gray eyes tracking her movements, of the way he smiled when she made a joke, of how seriously he bent over his slate forming letters with the careful concentration of someone learning a new skill. After class, when the other students had filed out with thanks and promises to practice their lessons, Caleb lingered. "I didn't know you needed grammar instruction," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice light. "I don't, but I figured Martha and Bill Donovan showing up to support you was good. Me showing up sends an even stronger message, that the town's most successful rancher thinks education is valuable enough to sit in a classroom and learn alongside miners and farmhands." Eleanor felt something soften in her chest. "That's very calculated for someone who claims not to want anything from me." "I said I wasn't asking for anything. I never said I wasn't willing to do things that might make you think better of me." He smiled, and it transformed his usually serious face into something almost boyish. "I'm courting you, Eleanor Hayes. You should know that up front, slowly, respectfully, with no expectations of success, but courting you nonetheless." "I don't have time for courting. I have a school to run, evening classes to teach, a town to prove myself to." "I know. That's why I'm doing it slowly. I'm a patient man, and you're worth waiting for." Eleanor wanted to argue, to list all the reasons this was a terrible idea, to protect herself from the vulnerability of letting someone matter. But looking at Caleb's honest face, at the sincerity in his eyes, at the way he'd shown up to support her even when it meant sitting through lessons he didn't need, she found she didn't have the energy to fight this particular battle tonight. "You're making things complicated," she said instead. "Life's already complicated. I'm just making it complicated in a direction that might lead somewhere good. Or somewhere painful. Maybe both. Most worthwhile things are." Eleanor couldn't argue with that. "I need to lock up the schoolhouse." "I'll wait and walk you home." "Caleb, humor me. One last time tonight." She locked up and let him walk her the 50 yards to her cottage, both of them quiet in the darkness. At her door, he paused. "I meant what I said earlier. I'm here, I'm patient, and I'm not going anywhere. Take all the time you need to figure out if that matters to you." Then he was gone, and Eleanor was alone with her thoughts and the unfamiliar sensation of hope tangled with fear. The next 2 weeks unfolded with a rhythm that felt almost sustainable. Brock accepted her terms, publicly apologized in front of the town council, paid a fine of $50 that doubled Eleanor's book budget, and signed a written agreement to leave her and her students alone. Eleanor used the money to order advanced texts from Denver, reference books that would let her teach history, and science properly. The evening classes grew to 20 regular attendees, including several women who'd been too intimidated to come before. Eleanor taught grammar, arithmetic, basic law, and contract reading. Caleb attended every session, his presence both a declaration of support and a quiet reminder to anyone considering causing trouble that Eleanor Hayes had powerful allies. During the days, her classroom thrived. Children who'd been skeptical at first now competed for her approval, bringing her wildflowers and interesting rocks, asking questions that stretched beyond the curriculum into genuine curiosity about the world. Eleanor found herself planning field trips to study local geology, organizing debates on territorial governance, pushing her students to think critically about everything from mining practices to women's suffrage. And through it all, Caleb was there. Not constantly, not oppressively, but with a steady presence that felt less like pursuit and more like partnership. He fixed the schoolhouse's leaking roof without being asked. He brought books from his personal library that he thought her students might enjoy. He showed up at town council meetings and advocated for increased education funding with the same passion he brought to water rights and ranch management. He courted her, as he'd promised, slowly and respectfully. And despite her best intentions, despite her determination to remain independent, despite every self-protective instinct she possessed, Eleanor found herself courted. One Saturday afternoon, 6 weeks after her arrival in Redwood Crossing, Caleb invited her to ride out to his ranch for dinner. Mrs. Chen was preparing roast chicken, he said, and it seemed a shame for Eleanor to spend another weekend alone with lesson plans and loneliness. Eleanor knew she should refuse. Accepting felt like acknowledging something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. But she was tired of lesson plans and loneliness, tired of being endlessly strong and self-sufficient, tired of pretending she didn't look forward to Tuesday evenings when Caleb would arrive early for grammar class and stay late to walk her home. "I'll come," she said, "but just for dinner, not as anything else." "Just for dinner," Caleb agreed, though his smile suggested he knew exactly what she was really agreeing to. The ride to Three Rivers Ranch was different this time. No injured shoulder, no broken stagecoach, no wary distance between their horses. They rode side by side through golden afternoon light, talking about everything and nothing. Caleb told her about his plans to expand the ranch, about the difficulties of managing cattle in mountain winters, about his hope to eventually breed horses that could handle the rough terrain better than the stock currently available. Eleanor told him about her student's progress, about the evening class student who'd just successfully read his first complete book, about her plans to start a small lending library. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, without the careful formality that had marked their earlier interactions. Eleanor realized with some surprise that she'd stopped performing for Caleb weeks ago, stopped proving her competence and strength, stopped defending her right to exist in a space not designed for women like her. With Caleb, she could just be Eleanor, brilliant and flawed, strong and vulnerable, determined and occasionally terrified. It was remarkably freeing. Mrs. Chen greeted them at the ranch house with her usual gruff efficiency, but Eleanor caught the older woman's approving glance as Caleb helped her dismount. Dinner was served at the long wooden table Eleanor remembered from her first visit: roast chicken with herbs, fresh bread, vegetables from Mrs. Chen's garden, and apple pie that made Eleanor close her eyes in bliss at the first bite. "This is extraordinary," she said to Mrs. Chen. "I haven't eaten this well since Philadelphia." "Philadelphia food's got nothing on frontier cooking when it's done right," Mrs. Chen replied. "Just takes time and care, same as everything worthwhile." After dinner, Caleb walked Eleanor through the ranch, showing her the progress on a new barn, introducing her to his favorite horses, pointing out improvements he'd made over 15 years of hard work. Eleanor found herself seeing him differently in this context, not just as the respected rancher who'd helped her, but as a man who'd built something substantial through intelligence and persistence. Someone who understood the value of long-term investment in a future that might not pay dividends for years. Someone like her, actually, just working with different materials toward different goals. They ended up on the porch as sunset painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold, sitting in comfortable chairs with coffee and watching the sky change colors. "Can I tell you something?" Caleb said quietly. "Always. When I first saw you on that road with your rifle raised, I thought you were the most terrifying woman I'd ever met. Fierce and uncompromising and absolutely certain you didn't need help from anyone. I was all those things. I still am, I know. But now I also know you're kind to children who struggle with reading, patient with adult students who can barely hold chalk correctly, and generous enough to offer your attacker a path to redemption instead of just revenge. You're not just fierce, Eleanor. You're wise. And watching you build something meaningful in Redwood Crossing while fighting people who want to see you fail, it's been the most inspiring thing I've witnessed in years. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. You make me sound better than I am. I make you sound exactly as good as you are. You just don't let yourself see it because you're too busy surviving to appreciate how much you're accomplishing. Caleb, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I promised I wouldn't push, and I won't. I just wanted you to know that I see all of you, not just the strength you show the world, but the kindness you think you have to hide. And I think you're remarkable. Eleanor turned to face him fully. This man who'd somehow seen past every defense she'd constructed, who'd offered support without demanding surrender, who'd courted her with patience and respect she'd never expected to find in a frontier rancher. I'm afraid, she admitted quietly. Of this. Of you. Of what it might mean to let someone matter. I know, but fear and courage can occupy the same space, remember? You just have to decide which one gets to drive. Eleanor laughed shakily, recognizing her own words thrown back at her. That's not fair, using my philosophy against me. All's fair in courting and teaching. Caleb's smile was gentle. Stay here tonight, in the spare room, properly chaperoned by Mrs. Chen. It's too late to ride back safely anyway. He was right about the late hour, and Eleanor found herself nodding before she could overthink it. Mrs. Chen showed her to the same room she'd occupied that first night. It felt like years ago instead of weeks, and Eleanor lay in the comfortable bed staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how her carefully planned independent life had gotten so complicated so quickly. The answer, she realized, was that Caleb Morgan had seen her completely and decided she was worth pursuing anyway. Not despite her fierce independence, but because of it. Not by trying to rescue or reform or control her, but by supporting her in being exactly who she was. It was everything she'd never let herself want. And lying alone in the darkness, Eleanor finally admitted to herself that she wanted it. She wanted him. The question was whether she was brave enough to reach for it. Morning came with pale light filtering through lace curtains and the smell of coffee drifting up from downstairs. Eleanor dressed carefully, aware that returning to town from Caleb's ranch after staying overnight would generate talk regardless of Mrs. Chen's presence as chaperone. She'd learned to care less about gossip over the past weeks, but she wasn't reckless. Reputation still mattered, especially for a schoolteacher. Caleb was waiting at the breakfast table, freshly shaved and looking far more rested than Eleanor felt. Mrs. Chen served eggs and bacon with her usual efficiency, though Eleanor caught the housekeeper's knowing glance between them. I'll ride back with you, Caleb said as they finished eating. Make sure you arrive safely. People will talk. People already talk. Might as well give them something worth discussing. Eleanor should have argued, should have insisted on propriety and distance. Instead, she found herself smiling. You're impossible. I'm persistent. There's a difference. They rode back to Redwood Crossing through crystalline autumn air, the mountains sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Eleanor felt something shift inside her during that ride, a loosening of the rigid control she'd maintained since arriving in Montana territory. She was still fiercely independent, still determined to succeed on her own merits. But maybe, just maybe, allowing someone to stand beside her wasn't the same as depending on them. The shift in their relationship didn't go unnoticed. Over the following weeks, Eleanor caught knowing looks from Martha Donovan, raised eyebrows from other parents, and a few snide comments from men at the saloon who thought a schoolteacher courting a wealthy rancher proved something unsavory about her character. Eleanor ignored them all and focused on her work, which was expanding faster than she'd anticipated. The evening classes had become so popular she'd started offering 2 sessions, basic literacy on Tuesdays and advanced skills on Thursdays. Her classroom enrollment had grown to 34 children, with 2 more families having moved to the area specifically because they'd heard Redwood Crossing finally had a teacher who stayed. And the town council, grudgingly impressed by her results, had approved funding for a library addition to the schoolhouse. Eleanor was building something that would outlast her, something that would change Redwood Crossing for generations. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something even larger. The crisis came in late October when word reached Redwood Crossing that the Bellamy Gang, a group of outlaws who'd been terrorizing mining camps across Montana territory, had been spotted in the mountains 20 miles north. The gang was known for violent raids, stealing payroll and supplies, and leaving destruction in their wake. The territorial marshal had been tracking them for months without success. The town council called an emergency meeting. Eleanor attended, as she always did, sitting in the back and listening as the men debated defensive strategies. Some wanted to hire additional guards for the bank and general store. Others advocated forming a militia to hunt the gang proactively. Hartwell, predictably, worried more about protecting his mine's payroll than about the safety of ordinary citizens. Caleb listened to the arguments, his expression growing increasingly grim. Finally, he stood. We need to think beyond just protecting property. The Bellamy Gang doesn't just steal, they hurt people. Women and children especially. If they hit Redwood Crossing, our first priority has to be evacuating vulnerable citizens to safe locations. And where exactly do you propose we evacuate them to? Hartwell asked skeptically. We're surrounded by wilderness. There's nowhere to go. Three Rivers Ranch. It's defensible. It's got supplies to last weeks, and it's far enough from town that raiders focused on the bank, and stores wouldn't bother with it. I'm offering shelter to any family that needs it if the gang comes this way. The offer was met with surprised silence. Then one of the other council members spoke up. That's generous, Morgan, but impractical. We can't evacuate the whole town on speculation. We'd look like cowards. We'd look prepared, Caleb countered. And I'm not suggesting everyone evacuate. Just families with young children, elderly, anyone who can't defend themselves. Let them shelter at my ranch while the rest of us deal with the threat. Eleanor's mind was racing. Caleb was right about the vulnerability of certain populations, but his plan had a critical flaw. The schoolhouse was one of the most central buildings in town, which made it a potential target if the gang decided to cause maximum disruption. Her students would be sitting in a wooden building in the middle of whatever violence might occur. She raised her hand and Hartwell acknowledged her with visible reluctance. Miss Hayes, unless you have military experience we're unaware of, I'm not sure how education expertise applies here. Eleanor ignored the condescension. I'm proposing we temporarily relocate the school to Three Rivers Ranch. If Mr. Morgan is offering shelter to vulnerable populations, that should include the children during school hours. We can continue lessons in a safer location until the threat passes. The room erupted in debate. Some parents liked the idea immediately. It meant their children would be protected. Others objected to disrupting education or inconveniencing Caleb. A few questioned whether a woman should be making tactical suggestions at all. Caleb cut through the noise. I support Miss Hayes' proposal. I've got a barn we can convert to a temporary classroom. It's weatherproof, heated, and large enough for all her students. She can continue teaching while keeping the children out of harm's way. For how long? Someone asked. We don't know when or if this gang will actually show up. Then we make it permanent, Eleanor said, the idea forming even as she spoke. Not just for the current threat, but as a general improvement. The schoolhouse in town is cramped and poorly equipped. If Mr. Morgan is willing to provide space on his ranch, we could build a proper school there. Larger classrooms, better ventilation, room for the library expansion we've already approved. Students could board during the week if their families live far from town, the way they do at schools back east. She was improvising now, but the vision crystallized as she spoke. A real school, not just a repurposed town hall. A place where education was treated as seriously as mining or ranching. A legacy that would transform how frontier communities approach learning. The council debated for another hour before finally voting to approve the temporary relocation, with the understanding that they'd revisit the question of a permanent school once the immediate threat passed. Eleanor left the meeting exhausted but energized, her mind already reorganizing lessons for the new space. Caleb caught up with her outside. That was either brilliant or insane. Why not both? Eleanor smiled despite her fatigue. You offered your ranch as shelter. I'm just taking you up on it comprehensively. I wasn't expecting you to turn a defensive measure into an educational revolution. I rarely do anything halfway, Caleb. You should know that by now. His expression softened. I do know that. It's one of the things I love about you. The words hung in the cool night air between them, more significant than they should have been. Love. Not admiration, not respect, not courtship interest. Love. Eleanor felt her heart hammer against her ribs. Caleb. I know. Too soon, too much, too complicated. He held up his hands. I'm not asking you to say it back. I'm just stating a fact. I love you, Eleanor Hayes. Your fierce independence, your brilliant mind, your stubborn refusal to be anything less than exactly who you are. I love all of it. We've only known each other 3 months. I've known you long enough to be certain. You don't have to be certain yet. I can wait. Eleanor looked at this man who'd seen her at her worst and her best, who'd offered support without demanding surrender, who was currently proposing to let her turn his ranch into a school because he believed in her vision. She thought about the life she'd built in Redwood Crossing, the students who needed her, the evening classes that were changing adult lives, the community she was slowly earning a place in. And she thought about how all of it was better, stronger, more sustainable because Caleb Morgan had chosen to stand beside her, rather than in her way. I'm not ready to say it back, she admitted quietly. But I'm not ready either, if that makes sense. I'm somewhere in between, figuring out if letting someone matter is worth the risk of being hurt. That's fair and honest. I can work with honest. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the space between them charged with possibility. Finally, Eleanor spoke. Help me plan the temporary school. I'll need to reorganize the curriculum, arrange transportation for students, coordinate with parents about the schedule changes. It's a massive undertaking. I'll help with whatever you need. Though fair warning, Mrs. Chen is going to have opinions about 30-some children disrupting her domain. Eleanor laughed. Mrs. Chen has opinions about everything. I suspect we'll manage. The next week was controlled chaos. Eleanor worked with Caleb to convert one of his barns into a functional classroom, whitewashing walls, installing rough benches, setting up her precious books on improvised shelves. Parents brought supplies, lamps for light, a stove for heat, slates and chalk donated by families who wanted to contribute. The community came together in a way Eleanor hadn't seen before, united by the shared goal of protecting their children. Mrs. Chen, as predicted, had many opinions, but she also contributed practical solutions, designating space for students to eat lunch, organizing a rotation of parents to help with meal preparation, and establishing firm rules about respecting ranch property. Within a week, the barn-turned classroom looked almost professional. School reopened on Monday, and Eleanor stood before her students in this new space feeling both strange and right. This wasn't what she'd planned when she came to Redwood Crossing, but then nothing about her journey west had gone according to plan, and somehow that had worked out better than she could have imagined. Welcome to our temporary school, she said to the assembled children. I know this is different from what you're used to, but different doesn't mean worse. In fact, I think this change is going to make us all better, more adaptable, more resourceful, more capable of thriving even when circumstances aren't ideal. Those are frontier skills worth having. The children settled into the new routine with surprising ease. Eleanor discovered that teaching in a barn on a working ranch provided unexpected educational opportunities. Science lessons could include studying animal biology firsthand. Mathematics could incorporate calculating feed costs and breeding schedules. History could connect to the lived reality of building something from nothing in a challenging environment. The Bellamy gang never came to Redwood Crossing. The territorial marshal finally caught up with them 30 miles north and arrested most of the members after a brief gunfight. The immediate threat passed, but by then, Eleanor's temporary school had proven so successful that parents started petitioning the town council to make the arrangement permanent. The debate that followed consumed 2 full council meetings. Hartwell argued that the town couldn't afford to build a new school building. Others questioned whether a school on private property was appropriate. Some worried about the precedent of major town institutions existing outside town boundaries. Caleb listened to all the objections, then stood to address the council. Gentlemen, I am proposing a solution that benefits everyone. I'll donate the land where the current temporary school sits, 5 acres, enough for a permanent building plus future expansion. The town can build the school it needs without the cost of purchasing property. In return, I ask only that Eleanor Hayes be appointed as permanent headmistress with full authority over curriculum and operations. That's putting a lot of power in the hands of one woman, Hartwell said carefully. That's putting power in the hands of the person who's proven she knows what she's doing, Caleb corrected. Miss Hayes has increased literacy rates in this town by 40% in 4 months. Her evening classes have given adult students skills that directly translate to economic opportunity. She's built something remarkable, and she's done it while facing opposition, violence, and constant questioning of her competence. If anyone has earned full authority over education in Redwood Crossing, it's her. Martha Donovan stood from the audience. I'd like to speak in support of Mr. Morgan's proposal. My children have learned more in 4 months with Miss Hayes than in 2 years with previous teachers combined. My husband and I have both benefited from her evening classes. This town would be foolish to let someone with her talent and dedication operate under anything less than full authority. Other voices joined in. Parents, evening class students, even a few council members who'd been quietly supportive of Eleanor's work all along. The tide was turning, and Eleanor felt something powerful swell in her chest. This was community, real community, people coming together to protect something they valued. The vote passed, 6-1, with only Hartwell dissenting. Eleanor Hayes was appointed permanent headmistress of Redwood Crossing School, with full authority over curriculum, operations, and hiring as the school grew. Caleb's land donation was accepted, and the council approved funding for a proper school building to be constructed the following spring. After the meeting, Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers, parents thanking her, students excited about the new building, community members congratulating her on the appointment. It was overwhelming in the best possible way, proof that she'd accomplished what she'd set out to do, establish herself as a permanent, valued part of this frontier community. When the crowd finally dispersed, Caleb was waiting. He didn't say anything, just offered his arm, and Eleanor took it, letting him lead her outside into the cool November evening. "You did it," he said quietly. "You came here with nothing but determination and a rifle, and you built something that's going to change this town for generations." "We did it," Eleanor corrected. "I couldn't have survived the first month without your support, couldn't have weathered Brock's assault without your defense, couldn't have created this school without your land and resources. You'd have found another way. You're Eleanor Hayes. Finding ways is what you do." Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him fully. They stood in the shadow of the schoolhouse, the mountains dark against a star-filled sky, and Eleanor felt the last of her resistance crumble. "I love you," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. "I didn't want to. I fought it for months, but I love you. Your patience, your respect, your absolute certainty that I could succeed even when I wasn't sure myself. You've been beside me through everything, supporting without controlling, helping without claiming ownership. And I love you for all of it." Caleb's face transformed with joy so pure it made Eleanor's chest ache. "Say it again." "I love you, Caleb Morgan. And I'm terrified of what that means, but I'm more terrified of living without it." He pulled her into his arms, and Eleanor went willingly, letting herself be held for the first time since arriving in Montana territory. She'd been so determined to stand alone, to prove she needed no one. But standing in Caleb's embrace, feeling his heart beat against her cheek, she understood that strength and partnership weren't opposites. They were complements. "Marry me," Caleb said into her hair. Eleanor pulled back slightly to look at his face. "That's not a question." "You're right. Let me try again." He took her hands in his, gray eyes serious and soft. "Eleanor Hayes, will you marry me? Not because you need me, but because we're better together than apart. Not because I want to rescue you or control you or change you, but because I want to build a life beside someone I respect and admire and love beyond measure. Will you marry me?" Eleanor felt tears streak down her face, but for once they were happy tears, tears of relief and joy, and the overwhelming realization that she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you, on one condition." "Name it." "I keep teaching. I remain headmistress of the school. I continue the evening classes. I keep building what I've started here. I won't give it up for marriage or anything else." Caleb smiled. "Eleanor, I'm not asking you to give up anything. I'm asking you to let me support everything you're building, to be your partner in creating the kind of community where education matters and women have real power. I want to marry the fierce, brilliant, stubborn teacher who held me at gunpoint and taught me that strength comes in forms I'd never considered. Why would I want you to be anything less than exactly who you are? You're sure about this? About me? I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Eleanor kissed him then, pouring months of resistance and fear and gradual trust into the contact. Caleb kissed her back with a gentleness that made her heart ache, his hands framing her face like she was something precious and powerful all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Eleanor was smiling through her tears. "We should tell Mrs. Chen," she said. "She'll want to start planning." "She's probably been planning since the day I brought you to the ranch with a split lip and stubborn determination." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and free in the mountain air. "Probably. She's perceptive that way." They walked back to where Caleb had left his horse, hands linked, planning a future that would include a spring wedding, a new school building, expanded evening classes, and a partnership built on mutual respect rather than traditional roles. The wedding took place in April, when wildflowers covered the mountains and the new school building was halfway complete. Eleanor wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself, practical but beautiful, much like everything else about her life in Redwood Crossing. Caleb wore his best suit and looked at her like she'd hung the stars personally. They were married by the circuit judge in front of the entire town, surrounded by students who'd become family, evening class attendees who'd become friends, and a community that had slowly learned to respect the fierce teacher who'd refused to conform to anyone's expectations but her own. Martha Donovan served as Eleanor's attendant and Mrs. Chen stood beside Caleb, both women looking satisfied in the way of people who'd seen this coming from the beginning. The ceremony was short and practical, with vows that emphasized partnership and mutual support rather than traditional obedience. When the judge pronounced them married, Caleb kissed Eleanor with joy and reverence, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Eleanor Hayes had become Eleanor Morgan, but she hadn't become any less herself in the transformation. The years that followed were full and rich and harder than either of them anticipated, because building anything worthwhile always was. The school expanded to include 2 additional teachers Eleanor hired and trained personally, with space for 70 students and a library that became the best in the territory. The evening classes evolved into a formal adult education program that drew students from neighboring towns. Eleanor became known throughout Montana Territory as an educational reformer, consulted by other frontier communities trying to establish lasting schools. She wrote curriculum guides, advocated for teacher training programs, and testified before the territorial legislature about the importance of public education. She did all this while remaining headmistress of Redwood Crossing School, which she considered her most important work. Caleb expanded Three Rivers Ranch into one of the most successful operations in the region, but his proudest accomplishment was always the school on his donated land. He served on the board, advocated for educational funding, and never missed a graduation ceremony. He was known as a man who believed education mattered as much as cattle or silver. They had 3 children over the next 7 years, 2 daughters and a son, each raised with books and horses in equal measure. Eleanor taught them to read before they could ride, to question before they could calculate, to think critically before they could write in cursive. Caleb taught them responsibility, stewardship, and the value of building something meant to outlast yourself. All 3 children attended their mother's school alongside miners' kids and ranchers' children, learning that intelligence and character mattered more than background or gender. All 3 grew up watching their mother command respect through competence rather than charm, watching their father support her authority without diminishing his own. The oldest daughter became a lawyer, the first woman to practice law in Montana Territory. The second became a doctor, establishing a clinic in Redwood Crossing that served the community for 40 years. The son took over Three Rivers Ranch, but also taught science at his mother's school, believing the 2 vocations weren't contradictory but complementary. Eleanor never forgot the woman who'd arrived in Redwood Crossing with nothing but determination and a rifle. She kept that Winchester in her office at the school, a reminder of where she'd started and what she'd overcome. Sometimes new teachers would ask about it, and Eleanor would tell them the story of warning shot fired at a stranger's boot, of a woman who'd refused to be rescued, of a partnership built on respect rather than traditional roles. "That rifle," she'd say, "represents my independence. The fact that it hangs unused on the wall represents my choice to share that independence with someone who never asked me to surrender it." Both things are important. Both things are true. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Caleb surprised Eleanor with a gift, a brass plaque for the school building that read, Redwood Crossing School, founded 1872, built on the principle that education is power, and power should belong to everyone, regardless of gender, background, or circumstance. Established by Eleanor Hayes Morgan, who taught us that strength and partnership are not opposites, but complements. Eleanor cried when she read it, much to Caleb's amusement. "I thought you'd stopped crying years ago," he teased gently. "I stopped crying about hardship. I never stopped crying about joy." They stood together looking at the building Eleanor had started in a converted barn, now a proper school with multiple classrooms, a library, laboratories, and a gymnasium. It served 200 students and employed 8 teachers. It was the best school in Montana Territory, and it existed because one stubborn woman had refused to accept that education wasn't worth fighting for. "I'm proud of you," Caleb said quietly, "of everything you've built, everything you've become, everything you've taught this community about what's possible when you refuse to accept limitations." "I'm proud of us," Eleanor corrected, "of what we built together. I couldn't have done any of this without your support, your land, your willingness to believe that a woman could be fierce and soft, independent and partnered, strong enough to change a community, and vulnerable enough to love and be loved. You were always all those things, Eleanor. I just got lucky enough to witness it." They walked home through the spring evening, past the school that bore Eleanor's vision, past the ranch that Caleb had built, through the town that had become theirs not through conquest but through contribution. And Eleanor thought about that dusty road where she'd fired a warning shot at a stranger, never imagining that the stranger would become her partner, her love, the person who'd stand beside her while she changed the world in the small, profound ways that mattered most. She'd come to Montana Territory to teach children to read. Instead, she'd taught an entire community that women could lead, that education was power, that partnership didn't require surrender, and that the most radical act was simply being exactly who you were without apology. It was more than she'd hoped for, better than she'd planned, and exactly what she'd needed even when she hadn't known to want it. And when Eleanor Hayes Morgan finally retired from teaching at age 62, having educated 3 generations of frontier children and transformed how Montana Territory thought about education, she did so knowing she'd accomplished everything she'd set out to do and discovered several things she hadn't. She'd proven that a woman with a rifle and determination could build something lasting. She'd learned that accepting help didn't mean surrendering independence. And she'd discovered that the greatest adventure wasn't conquering the frontier alone, but choosing to share it with someone who saw her completely and loved her anyway. That night, sitting on the porch of 3 Rivers Ranch with Caleb's hand in hers and the mountains dark against the stars, Eleanor reflected on the strange, wonderful journey that had brought her here. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Caleb asked, as if reading her thoughts. "When you nearly shot my boot off?" Eleanor laughed. "I think about it often, how terrified I was, how determined not to show it, how certain I was that trusting anyone would be my downfall. And now? Now I know that trusting the right person isn't falling, it's flying." Caleb squeezed her hand. "I love you, Eleanor Hayes Morgan. I loved you when you were fierce and alone, and I love you now that you're fierce and partnered. Thank you for taking a chance on a rancher who interrupted your perfectly planned independent life." "Thank you for seeing me," Eleanor replied, "for really seeing me, not the woman you wanted me to be, but the woman I actually was, and for deciding that woman was worth waiting for." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds and built something remarkable together. The school stood solid in the distance, a monument to one woman's determination and one community's willingness to change. But more than that, it was proof that the best partnerships weren't about one person rescuing another. They were about 2 people choosing to stand side by side and build something neither could have created alone. And as stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, Eleanor Hayes Morgan, teacher, reformer, wife, mother, and the woman who'd held a rancher at gunpoint before falling in love with him, smiled with the deep satisfaction of a life well lived and a choice well made. She'd come west looking for purpose and found partnership instead, and it had made all the difference.